Greetings everyone. This is Goofy Harry. Prepare yourselves for what if Maester Aemon awoke inside Jon Snow and knew every Targaryen secret. Don't forget to like and subscribe for more. Let's begin. Chapter 1. The second waking the message came the way lies always came at Castle Black, quiet and from someone you trusted. Lord Commander. Ollie's voice cracked on the title the way it always did, like the boy still wasn't sure he'd earned the right to use it, or wasn't sure Jon had. There's a rider, says he's found your uncle, says it's urgent. Jon set down the letter he'd been drafting to Sam at Old Town, half a page about dragonglass stores, half a page he hadn't finished about what in the seven hells he was supposed to do with 8,000 wildlings crammed inside a castle built for a tenth that number, and looked up. Which uncle? He didn't have many left. Benjen had gone into the trees beyond the wall years ago and come back wrong if he'd come back at all. There was no word of him. Ollie, which uncle? Didn't say, Lord. Just said it's urgent, said you'd want to hear it yourself. There was something in the boy's face. Jon had spent 19 years reading faces in the dark, in Winterfell's kennels, in Castle Black's mess hall, in the black tents of a free folk camp where a wrong look could mean a knife between the ribs, and something in Ollie's face was wrong. Too still, too careful. A boy who'd watched wildlings burn his village to the ground didn't get that careful unless someone had told him exactly what expression to wear. Jon almost said so. Almost asked him straight out, "Who told you to say this?" He didn't. That was the last mistake the boy he'd been made. He walked out into the yard instead, and the cold hit him the way it always did at Castle Black. Cold that didn't announce itself but simply arrived, total and absolute, snow falling thick and gray in torchlight. Ghost wasn't with him. The wolf was somewhere past the kennels, restless the way he'd been restless all week, pacing the inner wall like he could smell something wrong on the wind and couldn't decide which direction it came from. Jon should have listened to that, too. The yard was empty. No rider. No horse steaming in the cold. Just men standing in a loose half-circle around him, the way men stood when they'd rehearsed it. And at the center of that circle, Sir Alizer Thorne's face, lit orange from the torch he held, wearing an expression that was almost sorrowful. "For the watch," Bowen Marsh said, and it wasn't a battle cry. It came out of him low and broken, a man apologizing even as he did the thing he was apologizing for, and the knife went into Jon's chest before Jon's hand had finished closing around the hilt of Longclaw. He didn't fall. Not yet. That was the strange part later when he had time to think about it, how long a body could keep standing after the first knife found it, how the mind kept insisting this isn't happening even while the body already knew otherwise. A second knife. Othel Yarwick's face, pale and sick with what he was doing it anyway. A third. He heard himself make a sound that wasn't a word. He got one hand on Longclaw's grip. He got the blade half out of the scabbard. It didn't matter. There were too many hands on him now, too many blades, and the world had gone from cold to a strange, burning heat that had nothing to do with fire, spreading out from his chest in a way that felt, absurdly, like something being poured out of him rather than something being taken. He went down into the snow. He heard Ollie's voice, small and shaking, and utterly certain he was doing right, say something Jon couldn't quite catch, and then he felt the last blade, small and precise, go in just beneath his heart, and the world tipped sideways and went white, and then it went dark. And Jon Snow, for the first time in his short, brutal life, stopped fighting. There was no light in the dark. That was the first wrong thing. He'd expected, if he'd expected anything, if a dying mind expects anything at all, the black cells or nothing, or his father's face, or the long stone hall of Winterfell's crypts where he used to go as a boy to sit with statues that couldn't disapprove of him for being what he was. He hadn't expected this. A dark that had weight to it, that pressed in from every side like deep water, and somewhere within that pressure, impossibly, another mind. Not gone, the other mind said, or didn't say. There were no words yet, only the shape of the thought, ancient and startled and fierce with a hunger Jon didn't understand. Not yet. There's still time, there's still. Jon tried to pull away from it. Everything in him that was still Jon Snow, 19 years of bastard pride and northern stubbornness, wanted no part of whatever this was. But the dark had no direction to flee in, and the other presence was not an attacker. It was reaching for him the way a drowning man reaches for driftwood, and beneath the desperation of it was something achingly familiar. Not familiar to Jon, but familiar in the way a smell can carry a memory that isn't yours. In the way a word in a foreign tongue can mean something before you've learned to translate it. "I know you," the presence said, and this time there were words, an old man's voice, dry as parchment, gentle in a way that made something in Jon's chest, the chest that had 3 knives in it in the world he'd left behind, ache with a grief he had no name for. "I know your father. I know what he was. I have spent 100 years not telling anyone what he was, and I am so very tired, and I do not think I have the strength left to die properly and leave it all behind me. Will you take it? Will you take all of it, boy, so it doesn't go to waste in the dark with an old blind fool who never got to see any of it matter?" Jon didn't understand the question. He understood somehow that it was being asked with love, and that terrified him more than the dark did. "Who are you?" he tried to say or think, or however you communicated in a place with no mouth and no air. "I was Aemon," the voice said, "of House Targaryen, once. A long, long time ago, before I was anything else. Before I was a maester, before I was an old man at the end of the world counting ravens for boys who thought I was only good for counting ravens. I loved a great many people, and I outlived every single one of them. And I am dying tonight at the Shadow Tower with no one beside me but a steward too frightened to speak. And I do not want to go into the dark with nothing to show for 100 years but grief." And then, not slowly, not gently, but all at once, the way a dam doesn't leak but breaks, it came. It wasn't memory the way Jon understood memory, a story you could tell yourself in order, beginning to end. It was everything at once, layered on top of itself like snow that had fallen for 100 winters without ever melting. And Jon Snow, whatever remained of him in that black and pressing dark, felt himself being buried under it and did not have the strength in that place to refuse. He knew High Valyrian suddenly, not as a language he might someday learn, but as a thing he had always known, its grammar sitting in him the way northern speech sat in him, effortless. He knew the succession laws Aegon the Conqueror had laid down, and the way Jaehaerys the old king had amended them, and the specific clause, buried, obscure, argued over by 3 generations of maesters, that governed what happened to a Targaryen's claim when that Targaryen was born outside of marriage, but acknowledged by blood. He knew the taste of Valyrian steel under a maester's hands as it was tested for purity. He knew the names of every dragon that had died at the Dance of the Dragons, and the tactical reasoning, sound reasoning, reasoning that had simply run into worse luck, behind every one of those deaths. He knew what it felt like to watch a father execute an uncle for treason and understand, with the particular clarity of a 14-year-old boy who has just decided never to want a crown, that the Iron Throne ate everyone who sat too near it. He knew, with a jolt that went through whatever was left of his mind like cold water, exactly who his own father and mother had been, and why a 100-year-old blind man had gone to his grave without ever once saying the words out loud. And beneath all of it, beneath the histories and the bloodlines and the endless catalog of a citadel-trained mind that had spent a century reading every book the world had bothered to write down, there was something else. There was the shape of a man, gentle, patient, furious in the quiet, controlled way of someone who has learned that fury spent loudly is fury wasted. A man who had watched the world call him blind and useless for 60 years while he quietly learned everything there was to know about the things that were coming to kill it, and who had died tonight, alone, believing none of it would matter because he'd told no one, because he'd been so afraid of what his blood might do to a boy he'd only known through letters and had come, impossibly, to love. "I'm sorry," the presence said, and it was fading now, thinning like smoke, like a man walking backward into fog. "I should have told you what you were the moment I understood it. I told myself I was protecting you. I think I was only protecting myself. I did not want to watch you become one more Targaryen the world found a reason to kill." "Don't go," Jon thought, and it startled him. How much he meant it. This stranger who was not a stranger, who had just poured 100 years of himself into whatever remained of a boy dying face-down in the snow at Castle Black. "I'm not going anywhere you aren't," Aemon said, and there was something in it that might have been laughter, might have been the closest thing to peace a man could manage on the way out of the world. "That's rather the point, isn't it? Wake up, Jon Snow. Wake up and be angry. You have every right to be. Wake up, and don't you dare waste it being afraid." Jon Snow's eyes opened onto snow. Not the black behind his own eyelids, the actual sky, gray-white and heavy with more snow coming, framed by the crenellations of Castle Black's inner wall. He was lying on his back in the yard, exactly where he'd fallen, and the cold under him was the cold of a body that had been lying in the open for hours. And there should have been pain. There had been 3 knives for, he remembered that clearly now, remembered it with a strange flat calm that felt entirely wrong for the memory, and there was none. There was only a vast, ringing silence in his chest, like a bell that has just finished tolling. He sat up. Ghost was there. Had been there the whole time, apparently. A white shape hunched low over him in the snow, not howling now, silent, ears flat, watching him with red eyes that held something Jon had never seen in them before. Not confusion. Recognition, and beneath the recognition, wariness. The way a wolf watches something that used to be familiar and has become, in some fundamental way, something else. He can feel it too, Jon thought, and the thought came in a voice that was his own, and also, underneath it, older, drier, edged with a scholar's precision he had never possessed before tonight. Direwolves aren't fools. He knows something rode back into this body with you. Jon looked down at himself. His jerkin was in ribbons, crusted black with frozen blood, and beneath the ribbons the skin was whole. Not scarred, whole, pale, unmarked, as though the knives that had opened him had never happened at all, as though whatever force had brought him back had simply refused the wounds, the way a hand refuses to accept a lie it's been told once too often. He should have been afraid. Some distant, buried part of him, the part that was still underneath everything. A boy who'd grown up being told he wasn't good enough to sit at his own father's table, expected to be afraid, expected panic, expected the shaking hands and the racing heart and the desperate need to run to someone, anyone, and ask them to explain what had just happened to him. That part of him was quiet now. Very quiet. In its place was something colder and steadier, and entirely without mercy for the men who had done this to him. "They'll have gone to the Lord Commander's tower," Jon said aloud, and his voice came out wrong, not wrong in pitch or timbre, but wrong in cadence, measured in a way 19-year-olds' voices rarely were. Ghost's ears twitched at the sound of it. Marsh will be telling himself it's finished. Thorne will be telling the men it was necessary. Ollie, something in him ached at the thought of the boy, sharp and complicated, grief and fury tangled together so tightly he couldn't have separated them if he'd tried. Ollie will be somewhere quiet, being sick, and no one will have thought to check on him, because no one at Castle Black ever thinks to check on the boy who's just done something he can't take back. He got to his feet. His legs held him. Of course they held him. There was nothing wrong with his legs. There had never been anything wrong with his legs. The knives had gone into his chest and his belly and his back, not his legs. And it was such an absurdly practical thought to be having in the middle of what should have been the most impossible moment of his life that Jon almost laughed. He didn't laugh. He walked. The common hall was lit and full when he reached it, which told him something useful before he'd even opened the door. Thorn hadn't tried to hide what had happened. He'd gathered the men and told them, straight out, the way you tell soldiers something that needs to sound like duty rather than murder. That was either very stupid or very shrewd, and knowing Alizer Thorn, knowing him now with a clarity that came from somewhere far older than 19 years of watching the man sneer across a training yard, Jon suspected shrewd. Thorn wanted witnesses. Thorn wanted every man in that hall to have heard him say it was necessary, so that no one man could later claim he alone had done the killing. Jon stood outside the door for a moment, in the cold, in the dark, and let himself feel, just for a moment, what was underneath the calm. Grief, yes. Rage, banked but real, the kind that didn't need to shout to be dangerous. And underneath even that, something he hadn't expected. A strange, aching gratitude for a blind old man he'd known for less than 2 years, and had never once suspected of carrying 100 lifetimes' worth of secrets, who had chosen, in his very last moment on earth, to give all of it to a bastard boy at the end of the world rather than let it die with him. I'm not going to waste it, Jon thought, and pushed open the door. The hall went silent the way a held breath goes silent. 90 men, near enough, the ones still loyal to the mutiny's leadership, the ones too frightened to leave, the ones simply too slow to have already fled into the dark toward wherever a man runs when he's helped kill his Lord Commander. Alizer Thorn stood at the head table where Jon himself had sat not 4 hours earlier, a cup of wine in front of him he hadn't touched. Bowen Marsh sat 2 seats down, and his face, when he looked up and saw who had just walked through the door, did something remarkable. It didn't go pale with fear. It went pale with something closer to relief, as if some deeply buried part of the Lord Steward had been praying all night that this exact impossible thing would happen. That's not possible, someone said Yarwick from the back, his voice cracking. No, Jon agreed and walked into the room, and the men nearest the door flinched back from him as though he might be cold to the touch, might carry winter on him the way the whites did. It shouldn't be. You put 4 knives in me, Sir Alizer. I counted them after 4. That's a thorough piece of work for men who claim they didn't want to do it. Get back. Thorn's hand had gone to his sword, and his voice, to his credit, didn't shake. Whatever else the man was, he had never once in Jon's experience been a coward. Whatever you are now, boy, you'll not. I'm not a white, Sir Alizer. Jon stopped perhaps 10 feet from the table, close enough that every man in the hall could see his face. See, there was nothing wrong with his eyes, nothing blue and dead about him. I don't imagine that's much comfort to you. A white, at least, you know how to fight. This is worse, isn't it? This is a dead man standing in your hall asking you to explain yourself, and you don't have the first idea what to do with that. Bowen Marsh stood. His chair scraped back loud in the silence. Lord Commander. He stopped, hearing himself use the title, and something crossed his face that might have been shame or might have been the desperate hope of a man trying to undo, with a single word, an act he'd already understood he could never undo. Jon, I need you to know, I didn't do this out of hatred. You have to believe that. I've served the Watch 40 years. I watched you bring 8,000 wildlings through our gates, and I thought, God help me, I still think, that you were going to get every one of us killed. Mance Raiders people inside our walls. Giants. That thing you did at Hardhome, sailing off beyond the wall to save people who spent their whole lives raiding us, burning our villages. You thought I'd betrayed the Watch. Jon's voice was quiet. There was no mockery in it, which seemed to unsettle Marsh more than mockery would have. You're not wrong to have thought it, Bowen. You've spent your life defending a wall that's held back exactly one enemy for 8,000 years, and I brought that enemy's oldest foes inside the gates and called it strategy. Any reasonable man would have questions. Then you understand. I understand it perfectly. Jon let the silence sit for a moment before he went on, because he had learned. somewhere in the flood of memory that was still settling into him like silt after a flood, still sorting itself into things he knew and things he merely remembered knowing. That silence, held properly, did more work than shouting ever could. I understand it well enough to tell you exactly why you're wrong, and exactly why it's going to cost you everything. Because you didn't come to me with your questions. You didn't ask me to explain the wildlings, or Hardhome, or what I saw beyond the wall that made me willing to burn every old grudge the Watch has ever nursed just to bring living men through our gates instead of leaving them for the dead to raise as soldiers. You put 4 knives in my back instead, Bowen. Men have died for less, throughout the whole history of the Watch, and you know it, because you've read the same charters I have. You read the charters as a boy of 6 and 10 who's been Lord Commander for a season. Someone called from further back, Othel Yarwick, working up his courage now that the shock of Jon's return was thinning into something closer to old resentment. Don't lecture us on the history of the Watch, bastard. Jon turned toward him, and something in his expression made Yarwick's bravado falter halfway through the sentence. The first Lord Commander of the Night's Watch, Jon said, and the words came without effort, without the halting recall of a man reaching for a fact he half remembered, was a man named Nerve who is recorded nowhere in any charter still held at Castle Black, because the original charters burned in the fire that took the old library in the reign of the third Lord Commander, a man called Jarman Sunfire, no relation to the dragon. A bad joke among Meisters for 600 years now, because everyone always makes it once. What we call the founding oath was reconstructed 40 years after that fire from 3 surviving fragments and the memory of men who'd sworn it as boys, which is why there are 2 versions of the oath still argued about at the Citadel, the version we swear today, and the version some scholars believe was actually sworn at the founding, which is shorter and colder and doesn't mention love at all. He let that settle. I know that, Othel, not because I've studied at the Citadel. I know it because I know things now that I had no right to know 4 hours ago. And every one of you standing in this hall is about to have a very hard choice to make about what that means for you. The hall had gone entirely still. Even Thorn, hand still resting on his sword hilt, had gone quiet, watching Jon with an expression that was working hard to stay contemptuous and was losing the fight. "You're bluffing," Thorn said, but it came out thinner than he'd meant it to. "Trickery. The Red Witch's work some glamour. Ask me something only a Maester of 40 years' study would know, Sir Alizer, and I'll answer it, and then you can decide for yourself whether that's a glamour or whether something rather larger than either of us happened tonight." Jon's voice didn't rise. That was, he understood now, entirely the point. Aemon had spent 100 years learning that men feared calm far more than they feared shouting, because shouting was a thing they knew how to answer. Or we can skip that part, because I think you already know, don't you? I think some part of you knew the moment I walked through that door, because you've spent 30 years training boys to fight, and you know the difference between a man who's frightened underneath his calm and a man who simply isn't frightened at all. Look at me and tell me which one you're looking at. Nobody spoke. Snow had begun to fall past the high windows again, fat and silent, and somewhere outside a dog barked twice and went quiet. "I'm not here to kill every man in this hall," Jon went on into that silence, and let some of the coldness go out of his voice, not all of it, but enough that the men nearest him, the ones who'd only stood at the back and watched and hadn't lifted a blade, began to breathe again. "Most of you didn't put a knife in me. Most of you stood in this hall tonight because you were told to, and because you were frightened of what would happen if you didn't, and I understand fear, better than most of you understand anything. Fear isn't a crime at the wall. It's the only sensible response to living here." A faint, humorless smile. "But some of you did put a knife in me, And some of you organized it and lied to a grieving boy to get me alone in that yard, and stood there and watched while I bled out in the snow, and I intend to know every single name before this night is finished. And what will you do with the names? Marsh's voice was very quiet now. Hang us. You'll need every sword you have left when the dead come, Jon. You know that better than any of us. I know it better than you can imagine, Bowen. Something old and tired moved behind Jon's eyes, gone as quickly as it came. That's rather why I'm not going to hang all of you, however much some of you deserve it. But I want to be extremely clear about something, because I think it's the thing you all misunderstood most badly tonight, standing in that yard with your knives out, congratulating yourselves on saving the watch from a Lord Commander who'd lost his senses. He walked forward slowly, until he stood directly across the table from Thorne, close enough that the older man had to either meet his eyes or visibly look away. And Alizer Thorne, whatever else he was, had never in his life looked away from anything. I didn't bring the free folk through that gate because I'd gone soft, or because I loved them, or because some wildling woman had turned my head. Jon's voice had dropped, quiet enough now that men strained forward to hear it, which was, again, exactly the point. I brought them through because I have seen what's coming, Sir Alizer, with my own eyes at Hardhome, and I understood something that night that none of you have ever had cause to understand, because none of you have stood in that cove and watched dead children walk into the sea and come back up on the other side as soldiers for an army that does not tire, does not eat, does not fear, and does not stop. Every man, woman, and child left north of this wall when that army arrives becomes another sword in its ranks. Every wildling I turned away at that gate wasn't a threat kept out. He was a weapon handed to the only enemy that has ever mattered. He let that sit. You called it treason. I call it arithmetic. And I promise you, on every oath I've ever sworn, that arithmetic is going to matter a great deal more than any of us wants it to, and soon. Fine words, Yarwick said, though his voice had lost most of its bravado. Fine words don't put back the trust you spent, Snow. Half this watch will never follow you again after tonight, no matter what tricks you've learned in the last 4 hours. They don't need to follow me out of trust, Jon said. I'd have preferred it. I think most men would rather be led out of trust than out of fear, myself included. But I've learned something else tonight, Othel, along with the history of the founding oath, and rather more than I ever wanted to know about my own family. A flicker of something dark and personal crossed his face there, gone as fast as it came, and he did not explain it, and it's this. Fear is faster to build than trust, and slower to burn through, and right now, tonight, with what's coming south from beyond the wall, I don't have the luxury of waiting for trust to grow back on its own. So I'll take fear if that's what's on offer. I'll take it, and I'll use it to hold this castle together long enough to matter, and I will earn the rest back later, if there is a later, which is rather more in doubt tonight than it was yesterday, and that, Sir Alizer, is on you. He turned, finally, to address the room at large, and something in the set of his shoulders had changed, not larger, not more imposing in any way a man could point to, but settled, entirely certain, the way a man stands when he has stopped asking himself whether he has the right to be standing there at all. Here is what happens now, Jon said. Every man who lifted a blade against me tonight will be named, and will answer for it before this watch, under the old law, the way treason has always been answered for here, not by mob, not by torchlight in a yard, but by trial in daylight before witnesses, the way it's meant to be done. That includes you, Bowen, and you, Sir Alizer, and it will include Ollie, wherever that boy has gone to hide from what he's done tonight, though God knows I mean to see him treated more gently than the rest of you, because a boy that age shouldn't have to carry what you all handed him. His voice caught very slightly on that, the only place in the whole speech where the calm cracked even a hair, and then it steadied again. Every man who did not lift a blade, who stood in this hall tonight because he was afraid, or confused, or simply following the only leaders he had left, every one of those men keeps his cloak, keeps his post, and answers to me starting tomorrow morning as though none of this happened, because I need every sword this watch has, and I am not going to bleed this castle dry punishing fear when the real enemy is 3 days' hard ride north of here, and getting closer every night that we waste on grudges. Nobody moved, nobody spoke. Jon let the silence stretch, and then, very deliberately, he reached out and picked up the untouched cup of wine sitting in front of Maester Thorne's place, and drank from it slowly, in front of every man in the hall, and set it back down. "I'm not a ghost," he said. "I'm not a white, and I'm not touched by some glamour, and I promise you every single one of you is going to have a great deal of time to wonder what I actually am, because I intend to be Lord Commander of this watch for a good deal longer than any of you were hoping for 4 hours ago. Sir Maester, your sword, please. Bowen, yours as well. The rest of you go to your beds. There's a black cell being readied, and it's going to be crowded tonight, and none of you are helping matters standing here staring at me like I've grown a second head." For a long moment, nobody in the hall moved at all. Then Maester Thorne slowly, with the particular dignity of a man who has decided that resistance now would only be undignified rather than useful, drew his sword and laid it on the table. It was well past midnight before the hall finally emptied, before the black cells were filled with the dozen men who'd actually held knives that night, before Jon had walked every foot of Castle Black's inner wall twice, checking posts, speaking to men who flinched when he addressed them, and then, slowly, unwillingly, but genuinely settled, because whatever else had happened to their Lord Commander tonight, he was still asking after their families, still remembering which of them had wives at Mole's Town, still doing all the small, unglamorous things that made men trust a leader far more than any speech about founding oaths ever could. Dolorous Ed found him at the base of the wall's great iron door, staring up into the dark where the winch cage disappeared into the ice, snow settling on his shoulders like it had settled on the dead. "They're saying you rose up out of the snow like something out of an old wife's tale," Ed said, and walked into the hall and quoted charter law at Sir Maester until he handed over his sword like a scolded boy. He paused. "Personally, I think that's an improvement on most of the stories going around tonight. Somebody swore you had blue eyes when you walked in. Somebody else swore you didn't have a scratch on you, which, begging your pardon, Lord, having seen you go down with what looked like half a dozen good watch daggers in you, seems a bit much even for a miracle." "4," Jon said. "It was 4. 4's still a lot of daggers for a man who's standing here chatting with me about it." Jon looked at him for a long moment, at Ed's familiar, unimpressed, deeply weary face, the one face at Castle Black that had never once looked at him and seen anything other than exactly what he was, and felt something loosen in his chest, some tightness he hadn't fully noticed he'd been carrying since he opened his eyes in the snow. "I don't entirely know what happened to me tonight, Ed," he said, and it was, strangely, a relief to say it out loud to a man who wouldn't demand it be explained in full or dressed up as something grander than it was. "I know I died. I remember it very clearly, dying. And I know I woke up again, and I know that somewhere in between I picked up 100 years of another man's memories, his knowledge. Nearly everything he ever learned or read or was told in confidence over a very long life." He exhaled, watching his breath fog in the cold. "I know things now I have no business knowing, about history, about magic, about my own family, which turns out to be rather more complicated than I ever imagined, and I haven't even begun to work out what to do with that particular piece of it. Sounds like a lot to be carrying," Ed said after a moment in the tone of a man commenting on the weather. You going to tell me who it was? The fellow who left all that behind in your head. His name was Aemon. Jon said it slowly, feeling the shape of it in his mouth, feeling something that might have been grief and might have been an entirely new kind of gratitude settle over him at the sound of it. He was a Maester, at the Shadow Tower. I only met him the once when I first came to the wall. He was already there, blind, ancient. Everyone treated him like furniture with a good memory. He wrote me a letter last year, told me I'd need friends more than I'd need honor someday. I didn't understand what he meant by it at the time. And now I think he meant it rather more literally than I gave him credit for. A ghost of something that might, in a better world, have grown into a smile touched the corner of Jon's mouth. He was Aemon Targaryen, Ed, son of a king who never sat the throne, brother to a king who did. He gave up a crown before I was even born because he decided the Iron Throne only ever brought grief to the people who sat on it. And he spent the rest of his life at the end of the world making sure no one ever found out what he was, because he was afraid of what people do to Targaryens, and afraid, I think, of what he might become if anyone ever asked him to be one again. Ed was quiet for a long moment, taking that in with the same flat calm he took everything in. So what you're telling me, he said finally, is that our Lord Commander, who I have personally watched stab things that were already dead and not flinch, and lead 8,000 furious wildlings through our front gate without losing a single man to a knife in the dark, which I still think is some kind of miracle nobody's given you proper credit for. That man just found out he's got 100 years of dragon-blooded royal secrets rattling around in his skull, and his solution to that news, so far, has been to walk into a hall full of the men who murdered him and lecture them about founding charters until they handed over their swords. That's more or less it, yes. Right, Ed nodded slowly, the way a man nods at news he's decided not to argue with because arguing wouldn't change any of it. Well, for what it's worth, Lord, and I want it on record that I say this without a shred of enthusiasm, because enthusiasm's never done me any good. I think you might be the first bit of luck this watch has had since before I took the black. Jon didn't answer right away. He looked up instead past the great door, up the endless black climb of the wall toward the dark sky beyond it, where somewhere out past 300 miles of frozen forest, something was already moving south, patient and ancient and utterly without mercy, gathering an army of every man, woman, and child who'd ever died within its reach. Aemon had known about it, had spent 100 years reading everything the world had ever bothered to write down about the others, quietly in the margins of his other work, telling almost no one, because Jon understood this now, with a clarity that had nothing to do with borrowed memory and everything to do with simply being a man who'd spent his whole life being disbelieved, because no one had ever been inclined to listen to an old blind man's warnings, however carefully reasoned, however true. They'll listen to me, Jon thought, and felt the coldness settle back over him, the same coldness that had carried him through the hall tonight, calm and absolute and entirely without fear. They'll listen, or they'll learn to fear me enough that it hardly matters whether they listen. I am done being the boy no one believed. I died for that boy tonight. Whatever's standing here now, it isn't going to make that mistake again. Get some rest, Ed, he said aloud. Tomorrow's going to be a long day. I've a trial to hold, a castle to put back together, and a great many letters to write to people who are not going to like what's in them. And after that, Jon looked north one last time toward the wall, toward the dark beyond it, and something moved behind his eyes that was older than 19 years, older than 100, old as the fire that had first raised dragons out of Valyria, and old as the ice that had first learned to hate it. After that, he said quietly, I think it's time somebody finally told the realm the truth about what's coming for it. All of it. Whether they want to hear it or not. He turned and walked back toward the Lord Commander's tower, snow settling white and silent on his shoulders, ghost falling into step beside him without a sound, and behind him in the dark, the great wall stood exactly as it had for 8,000 years, patient, ancient, and for the first time in a very long while, guarded by a man who was no longer afraid of anything it might have to face. Chapter 2. The Lord Commander's Ledger. They held the trial in the yard, because Jon insisted on it, and because the old law said justice at the wall was done in daylight, before witnesses, not behind closed doors where whispers could turn a hanging into a rumor, and a rumor into a grudge that outlived every man involved. The morning came up gray and bitter, wind cutting sideways off the ice, and every man not on watch stood packed into the yard to see it. Jon stood at the top of the steps below the Lord Commander's tower with Longclaw belted at his hip, cleaned now, the blood of the men who tried to kill him scrubbed from the pommel by his own hand, because he hadn't wanted Ed or anyone else doing it for him. He'd wanted to feel the weight of it himself. 12 men had held blades that night. He'd learned all their names by dawn. Some of them had confessed outright, too frightened or too honest to lie, and the rest he'd worked out through a method that would have surprised everyone watching if he'd explained it. Not torture, not threats, but simple, patient cross-questioning, the kind a Maester learns after a century of untangling contradictory testimony in the Citadel's own inquiries into malfeasance among its ranks. Men who are lying about the same event always disagree about the smallest details. Aemon had taught novices that lesson 100 times over the decades, in 100 small disputes over stolen bread and broken oaths, and Jon had used it without even having to think about where the trick had come from. Sir Alistair Thorne stood in the front rank of the accused, hands bound, chin lifted, the picture of a man determined to die well if dying was what came next. Bowen Marsh stood beside him, and where Thorne's face was carved from stone, Marsh's had the gray, sunken look of a man who hadn't slept and didn't expect to sleep again for a long while. Ollie stood apart from the rest, small and alone, guarded by 2 men who kept looking anywhere but at him. "Sir Alistair Thorne," Jon said, and his voice carried clean across the yard without him having to raise it, which was itself a small, unsettling thing for the men listening. A boy of 19 speaking like a man who had commanded armies. "You'll answer first, since you let it." "I'll answer for it gladly." Thorne's voice didn't waver. "I did what I believed was necessary for the survival of this watch. I'd do it again tomorrow if I believed it as certainly as I believed it that night. I won't beg you for my life, Snow, and I won't pretend regret I don't feel for the act itself, whatever comes of it. If that's cowardice in your eyes, so be it." "It's not cowardice." Jon studied him for a long moment. "It's the opposite, actually, which is rather the tragedy of you, Sir Alistair. You're not a coward, and you never have been. You're a man who decided, a long time ago, that the only way to keep this watch alive was to hold it exactly as it's always been held, and you never once stopped to ask whether the world outside these walls had changed while you weren't looking." He came down 2 steps, close enough now that Thorne had to tilt his chin to keep meeting his eyes. "I could hang you. Half this yard expects me to. Some of them would sleep easier for it." A pause. "I'm not going to." A murmur went through the crowd, surprise, some of it, and something else beneath the surprise that took Jon a moment to place. Relief. Men who had followed Thorne out of habit and fear rather than conviction, hoping desperately that this would not become the bloodbath the old law technically permitted. "You'll lose your rank," Jon went on. "You'll lose your voice in any council I hold from this day forward, and you'll spend the rest of your service at the wall doing exactly what every green boy who's ever taken the black does first, working the kitchens, mucking the kennels, standing the worst watches in the worst weather, until I decide you've earned back the right to hold a sword in this castle's name. That's not mercy, Sir Alistair. Don't mistake it for mercy. It's arithmetic, same as everything else I've told you since I woke up in that snow. I need every sword I can keep breathing and loyal when the real enemy comes, and hanging you would waste a man who spent 30 years training soldiers, out of nothing but spite. I don't have room in my ledger for spite anymore. I'm not sure I ever did. Thorne's jaw worked once, twice, and something passed behind his eyes that might, in a better light, have been the beginning of respect he would never once admit to feeling. Bowen Marsh. Jon turned. You didn't lead it. You believed it, though, enough to put the first knife in yourself, which in some ways is worse than following someone else's order. You've kept the accounts of this castle honestly for longer than I've been alive, and I know, because I've spent half the night going through your ledgers myself, that you've been quietly starving yourself these last 2 winters to make sure the stores stretched for the men under you. That's not nothing, Bowen. That counts for something even now. His voice hardened. But you'll answer the same as Thorne. Stripped rank, worse duties, and you'll do it standing beside every wildling I settle inside these walls, because I think you need, more than any other man in this yard, to learn what those people actually are before you die hating a shadow of them you built up in your own head out of fear. One by one, down the line, he did the same, stripping rank, assigning labor, refusing every plea for execution that men in the crowd half expected, and in some ugly corner of themselves wanted. 2 men he did hang, the 2 who, under questioning, had shown no remorse at all, who'd spoken of the killing not with Thorne's grim conviction but with something colder, an eagerness Jon recognized instantly for what it was, because Aemon's memory held 100 examples of exactly that kind of man, and knew precisely how dangerous it was to let one live inside a garrison at the edge of the world. Justice tempered with mercy for men who believed, wrongly, that they were doing right. No mercy at all for men who simply enjoyed the killing. And then, last, Ollie. The boy hadn't spoken since the mutiny. Jon had heard, second-hand, that he'd been found in the stables at dawn, curled against a stall wall, shaking, unable to explain to anyone why he'd done what he'd done, why he'd lied about a rider that never existed, why he'd led Jon out into that yard to die. Jon walked down the last 2 steps himself and crossed the yard to stand in front of him, and the whole assembly went quiet in a different way than it had for Thorne, a held, uncertain quiet, because everyone at Castle Black had watched Jon Snow care for this boy, had watched him try to teach him archery, had watched the strange, wary, aching kind of fondness grow between them, and no one knew, least of all Ollie, what that history was worth now. "Look at me," Jon said, and Ollie did, eyes red-rimmed, jaw trembling. "I didn't want to," Ollie said, before Jon could say anything else, the words coming out in a rush like they'd been dammed up all night. "I didn't. Sir Alizer said it was the only way. He said you were going to get us all killed. He said the wildlings would murder us in our beds if we didn't. My village, Lord, they burned my village. I watched them do it. And you brought them through our gates and called them friends, and I couldn't stop thinking about it. I couldn't stop seeing it. And Sir Alizer said if I just told you there was a rider." He broke off, sobbing now, 12 years old and utterly undone. "I'm sorry. I'm sorry. I'm sorry. I know it doesn't matter that I'm sorry, I know." "It matters," Jon said, quiet enough that only Ollie and the men nearest heard it. "It matters more than you think, Ollie. Not enough to undo what happened. Nothing undoes that, but it matters." He crouched down, so he was looking up slightly into the boy's face instead of down at him, the way you'd talk to a child who needed, more than anything, to not feel small. "You watched wildlings kill everyone you loved," Jon said. "And then you watched me walk 8,000 of them through our gate and call it necessary. And nobody, not me, not Thorne, not anyone in this whole castle, ever once sat you down and asked you how that felt, or explained properly why I did it, or gave you anything except orders and expectations. That's not an excuse for what you did. You helped kill me, Ollie, and there's no version of tonight where that isn't true. But it's not nothing either that a boy your age was left alone with a grief that big and no one to help him carry it. What happens to me? Ollie's voice was very small. Jon stood slowly and looked out over the yard at Thorne, at Marsh, at every man watching to see what mercy, if any, extended this far. You'll go to Eastwatch, Jon said. Cotter Pike will take you on, and you'll serve there instead of here, because I don't think either of us is ready for you to serve under my command again. Not yet, maybe not for a long while. You'll not hold a blade in anger again until Cotter tells me himself he trusts you with one. And you'll write to me, Ollie, every moon's turn. Tell me what you're learning, tell me if they're treating you fair, tell me if you're still having the dreams. His voice softened just slightly, just enough. I'm not your enemy. I never was. I know that's hard to believe this morning. Someday I hope you'll believe it again. The boy didn't answer. He only nodded, over and over, tears freezing on his face in the wind. And Jon turned away before either of them could say anything else, because there was nothing else that needed saying, and because some griefs were better left to finish themselves in private. The ravens started arriving that afternoon, and by evening Jon's desk in the Lord Commander's tower was buried under a small, growing mountain of correspondence. Every one of it, he understood within the first hour of reading. Some fresh problem dressed up as routine business, because the world beyond the wall's shadow had never once cared what chaos it was interrupting. He worked through the evening with a single candle burning low, and Sam's letter, when he finally reached it near the bottom of the stack, made him set everything else aside. Jon, Old Town is not what I expected. The Citadel is beautiful and enormous and full of men who have spent 40 years reading and could not, between the lot of them, tell you a single thing that would help against what's coming. I've been given a task copying scrolls in the deep archive, which sounds dull and is, mostly, except that they let me near the restricted stacks without quite realizing what I'm looking for, because they don't imagine a watch steward capable of understanding half of what's kept down there. I've found things, Jon. Old accounts, older than the Citadel's official histories admit to keeping, references to a war fought against the Cold Ones, long before the Age of Heroes, references to dragonglass being mined not for tools but for weapons against something specific, something the old texts won't name directly, as though naming it were dangerous in itself. There's a pattern in what's been deliberately removed from the record. Someone generations ago decided the world was safer not knowing certain things, and I don't yet understand why, but I intend to find out. I heard 3 days past that Maester Aemon had died at the Shadow Tower. I know you'll grieve that as much as I do, more probably, you knew him longer and better. I wish I could have been there. I keep thinking of all the things I never got to ask him, and now I never will. Write when you can. Tell me you're safe. I worry more than I let myself say. Sam Jon sat with the letter for a long time after he'd finished reading it, watching the candle flame bend and straighten in a draft that found its way through every gap in Castle Black's ancient stonework, no matter how well the mortar was patched. He's already found it, Aemon's memory said, somewhere behind his own thoughts, dry and fond and grieving all at once, the way you'd speak of a favorite student who's just proven himself cleverer than you dared hope. He's found the seam in the wall. Give him time, and he'll find the door. Jon picked up a fresh sheet of parchment and began to write, and found, without quite meaning to, that his hand had shaped the first line in High Valyrian before some cautious, newly awakened instinct made him strike through it and start again in the common tongue. Sam, Aemon didn't leave the world the way you think he did. I'll explain when I can do it properly in person and not risk this letter falling into the wrong hands on the road south. For now, trust me when I say this, keep looking. Whatever's been removed from those archives, someone removed it on purpose, and someone with that kind of reach doesn't do it without a reason worth killing over. Be careful. Trust no one at the Citadel with what you're finding, not even men who seem kind. Especially not men who seem kind. I'm alive. I'll tell you the whole of it soon, I promise you that, Jon. He sealed it and sat back, and let himself feel, for just a moment, the particular grief that had been sitting underneath everything else since the moment he'd woken in the snow. The grief of a man who'd lost someone he'd barely had the chance to know, and had somehow, impossibly, been given all of that someone's life in exchange, as though the universe had decided that if it couldn't give Jon back the Maester's presence, it would at least give him everything the Maester had ever been. It wasn't a fair trade. He understood that with a clarity that ached. 100 years of memory was not the same as 100 years of a man beside you, and no amount of borrowed wisdom could replace the actual sound of Aemon's voice, dry and patient, saying some men learn from other men's mistakes, and some men are too foolish or too stubborn, and it is very rare to meet a young man wise enough to be foolish on purpose. He would never hear that voice again except in memory, and memory, however vivid, was not company. Ghost, curled by the hearth, lifted his head and watched him with those unsettling red eyes, and Jon reached down without looking and let the wolf's cold nose press against his palm, and that, at least, was real. The Maester arrived 4 days later, in the gray light of a morning so cold the ravens refused to fly, riding up from the King's Road with 2 guardsmen and a covered cart of instruments and books. And the first thing Jon noticed about him, watching from the parapet as the party wound its way toward the gate, was how carefully the man sat his horse, not the seat of a soldier or a lord, but the deliberate, overcorrected posture of a scholar who had spent his whole life at a desk and was only now, in middle age, being made to ride further in a season than he'd ridden in the previous decade combined. His name, the letter that preceded him by 2 days had said, was Maester Aldrich, dispatched from the Citadel to fill the vacancy left by Aemon Targaryen's death, and Jon had read that letter 3 times over, feeling something cold and careful settle into place behind his ribs each time. They're sending someone to see what's here, Aemon's memory offered, unbidden, not merely to replace me. The Citadel does not waste a trained Maester on a garrison this small without cause, not in ordinary times, and these are not ordinary times. Someone at Old Town has heard rumors already of the mutiny, of the strange manner of its ending. They will have sent their sharpest man, not their kindest. How do you know that? Because it is what I would have done, boy, had I still sat on the conclave's inner councils 60 years ago, and men do not change so very much in 60 years. Watch him closely. He will be watching you closer. Jon met the party in the yard himself, which was, he understood even before he did it, itself a kind of statement. A Lord Commander did not always greet an arriving Maester in person, and Aldrich clocked the courtesy for exactly what it was, a flicker of calculation crossing his face before he dismounted and offered a bow precisely correct in its depth. No more, no less. Lord Commander. His voice was dry, careful, the voice of a man accustomed to choosing every word before he spoke it. Maester Aldrich, late of the Citadel, at your service. I understand you've had a difficult season. An honest word for it, Jon said. You'll have heard rumors on the road, I imagine. A few. Aldrich's eyes, pale, sharp, unhurried, moved over Jon's face with the frank appraising look of a man used to examining patients and finding the truth in small details others missed. Some of them rather fantastical. I try not to credit gossip until I've had the chance to see for myself. Wise, Jon said. You'll find most of it's true, though not, I think, in the way it's been told. I look forward to hearing the accurate version, my lord, when you have the leisure for it. A pause, and something in the Maester's expression sharpened very slightly. I understand Maester Aemon died the same night you were. Indisposed. That's right. A strange coincidence. I've thought so myself, Jon said, and offered nothing further, and watched the Maester file that away behind carefully neutral eyes. He installed Aldrich in the Rookery Tower, in the rooms that had briefly stood empty since Aemon's own long tenure there. And for the first week, the man behaved exactly as a new Maester ought, cataloging the ravens, reviewing the castle's stores of medicine, familiarizing himself with the ledgers Bowen Marsh had kept with such obsessive care for 2 decades. He was competent, unfailingly polite, and utterly, methodically thorough, and Jon watched him the way you watch a man laying a trap he thinks you haven't noticed. It was the 3rd week when Aldrich finally showed his hand, and he did it, characteristically, over something small. Jon had called a council in the common hall to discuss winter stores, an unglamorous, necessary meeting. Bowen Marsh present now in the reduced capacity Jon had assigned him. Tormund Giantsbane seated at the far end of the table looking deeply unimpressed by the entire proceeding, and Aldrich attending in his new capacity as the castle's Maester, taking notes with a scribe's neat economy. They were deep into an argument about grain allocation between the Watch's own stores and the growing wildling settlements along the Gift, Tormund insisting, not unreasonably, that his people be given the same rations as Watch brothers, Marsh arguing, with the reflexive caution of a man who'd spent 2 winters counting every measure of barley like it might be his last, when Jon cut through the deadlock with a single line that stopped every voice in the room at once. "There's precedent for exactly this dispute," he said. During the long winter that followed the reign of Jaehaerys I, the Watch integrated nearly 4,000 refugees from beyond the Wall after a mountain clan war drove them south seeking sanctuary. The Lord Commander of the day, Sir Gerald Good, if I recall the name correctly, resolved the same argument you're having now by tying rations not to origin, but to labor contributed, regardless of whether that labor came from a sworn brother or a settler. It worked. It kept the peace for 11 years, until the winter broke in half the refugees returned north on their own. Silence, for a moment, around the table. "That's not recorded anywhere in the Castle Black archives," Marsh said slowly. "I've read every scroll in this castle twice over, Jon. There's no record of a Sir Gerald Good." "No," Jon agreed. "There wouldn't be. The records that survive here are copies made after the Long Night Library fire I mentioned before, incomplete, and heavily edited by later Lord Commanders who didn't care for how the original accounts made certain decisions look. The full account exists at the Citadel, in the restricted section of the 3rd scriptorium, under a catalog heading that has nothing to do with the Watch at all, because whoever filed it centuries ago didn't want it easily found. Every eye in the room turned, without quite meaning to, toward Aldrich. The Maester had gone very still. His pen had stopped moving over the page in front of him, and when he spoke, his voice had lost some of its careful, measured neutrality. "My lord," he said slowly, "I have studied at the Citadel for 31 years. I have read every catalog heading in the 3rd scriptorium myself, as part of my training toward the Maester's chain. There is no such heading. There is no such record that I have ever encountered or heard whispered of by any man who has. There's a section," Jon said, unhurried, meeting the Maester's eyes across the table, catalogued under Valyrian agricultural treatises, 3rd shelf from the eastern wall, behind a locked case that only Archmaesters of the Order of Ravens hold the key to. Sir Gerald Good's full account of the refugee winter is bound into the back third of a manuscript that appears, on its spine and its opening page, to concern grape cultivation in the Rhoyne Valley. It was hidden there deliberately, roughly 140 years ago, by an archmaester who believed the account contained dangerous implications about a Lord Commander's authority to override royal grain allotments during a crisis, implications certain factions on the small council of the day did not care to see widely known. Aldrich had set down his pen entirely now. His face had gone carefully, deliberately blank, in the specific way of a man working very hard to control an expression that wanted badly to become something else. "How," he said, very quietly, "would you come to know that, Lord Commander? A detail so precisely specific. The shelf, the case, the false binding, that detail is not the kind of thing found in rumor or legend. That is the kind of detail known only to a handful of archmaesters currently living, myself not among their number, and to whatever records exist of who first hid it there." The room had gone entirely still. Tormund, Jon noted, had stopped looking bored, watching the exchange now with the sharp, wary attention of a man who understood, even without the vocabulary, that something dangerous was happening at this table. "I could tell you it was a lucky guess," Jon said. "You wouldn't believe me. You're too good at your work to believe me, and I think, underneath everything else, you'd be insulted if I tried." "Then tell me the truth," Aldrich said, and there was something naked in it now, stripped of the careful diplomatic distance he'd maintained for 3 weeks. "Because I have watched you, my lord, since the day I arrived, and I have listened to what you say in council, and I have begun to suspect, forgive me, I mean no disrespect by it, but I have begun to suspect that whatever knowledge you carry did not come to you through any ordinary study, and I would very much like to understand what it did come through, because I have taken oaths, Lord Commander, oaths that predate my service to this watch. Oaths concerning exactly what kind of knowledge is safe to leave loose in the world, and what kind is not. And if I told you," Jon said, "that the manner in which I came by it was not ordinary at all, that it was, in fact, the single strangest thing that has happened to me in a life that has included dying, being brought back, and leading 8,000 wildlings through this gate, would that satisfy your oaths, Maester Aldrich, or only sharpen them?" Aldrich was silent for a long moment. Around the table, Marsh had gone pale, and Tormund had leaned forward slightly, elbows on the table, watching with the open interest of a man who suspected he was about to hear something worth repeating around a fire for years to come. "I took an oath," Aldrich said finally, "when I earned my chain, to preserve knowledge and to use it wisely, and to be exceedingly careful about what knowledge I allowed loose in a world that has, historically, done a very great deal of harm with information it was not prepared to hold responsibly. I do not know what you are, my lord. I do not know how a bastard boy of 19 years has come to speak, in council, with the exact cadence and precision of a man who spent a lifetime in scholarship. But I intend to find out, because it is my duty to find out, and because I do not believe, forgive my bluntness, that duty and courtesy are always the same thing." "They aren't," Jon agreed. "I'd think less of you if you pretended otherwise." He let a silence settle, long enough that even Tormund shifted in his seat, and then he went on, more quietly. "I'll tell you the truth, Maester Aldrich, because I think you've earned that much honesty, and because I think, given time, you might turn out to be an ally worth having rather than a threat worth guarding against. But I'll tell you privately, not in council, and I'll ask you, not order you, ask you, to hold what I tell you close until I judge the moment right to let it travel further. Will you grant me that much trust, in exchange for the truth?" Aldrich studied him for a long, searching moment, the look Jon understood of a man weighing 31 years of citadel discipline against the simple, undeniable strangeness of what he'd witnessed at this table. "I'll hear it," the Maester said at last. "I make no promise beyond that." "That's fair," Jon said. "That's more than fair." He told him that night, in the small round chamber at the top of the rookery tower, ravens shifting and murmuring in their cages around them, a single lamp burning low against the cold. He told him about the mutiny, about the knives, about the strange black pressing dark between one heartbeat and the next, and about the voice that had found him there, old, patient, achingly familiar in a way Jon had had no right to feel toward a man he'd met only once in the flesh. Aldrich listened without interrupting, his scholar's face arranging and rearranging itself through disbelief, and something that might have been dawning horror, and finally, slowly, reluctantly, something that looked almost like grief. "You're telling me," he said when Jon finally fell silent, "that Aemon Targaryen's mind, or some portion of it, his memories, his learning, the whole accumulated weight of 100 years of study, passed into you in the moment of his death across half a continent with no ritual, no magic anyone living understands, simply because what? Because you loved him, because he loved you." "I don't fully understand the mechanism," Jon admitted. "I don't know if anyone does. I only know what happened and what it left behind. Blood magic requires proximity," Aldrich said slowly, half to himself, the scholar in him overriding for the moment the wariness. "Every text I've ever read on the old Valyrian traditions insists on it. Blood calling to blood must be close, must be bound by ritual, by intention, by 100 careful safeguards the old sorcerers built precisely because unbound transference was considered too dangerous to risk. Unless," he stopped himself. "Unless what? Unless the bond wasn't merely blood." Aldrich looked up, and something had shifted behind his eyes, not suspicion now, but a kind of stunned, careful wonder. "Unless it required a particular kind of blood. The old texts speak of it only obliquely, buried in commentary on the Targaryen dragon-bonding rites. Half a dozen scholars over 3 centuries dancing around the same forbidden implication without ever stating it outright. Because to state it outright would require admitting a truth the Citadel has spent 200 years trying very hard to bury." He leaned forward. "Aemon Targaryen was blood of the dragon. If you are also blood of the dragon, Lord Commander, not merely Ned Stark's bastard son, but something else entirely, then what happened to you on that night was not some unprecedented miracle. It was old magic, doing exactly what old magic was always rumored in the oldest and most dangerous texts to be capable of doing between 2 of the same blood. At the moment one of them died, and the other stood at death's very threshold himself." Jon said nothing. The silence stretched, thick with the weight of a truth he had not yet said aloud to anyone at all, though he had known it clearly, completely, without a shred of doubt, since the very first moment Aemon's memories had poured into him in the dark. "You already knew," Aldrich said softly, watching his face. "You already knew, and you haven't told a living soul." "No," Jon admitted. "I haven't. Will you tell me?" Jon looked at him for a long time, at this careful, exacting, 31-year trained man who had ridden a horse he barely knew how to ride, across half a kingdom, in the depths of winter, because his order had smelled something dangerous stirring at the edge of the world, and sent their sharpest mind to investigate it. A man whose whole life's discipline was built on the careful, patient handling of knowledge too dangerous to release carelessly into a world unprepared for it. "He's not your enemy," Aemon's memory said, quiet and certain. "He's exactly what the Citadel is meant to be when it remembers what it's for. Trust him, Jon, not with everything, but with this." "My father was never my father," Jon said finally, into the quiet, the words coming slow and careful, each one costing him something he couldn't entirely name. "Ned Stark loved me as his own, raised me as his own, protected me with a lie that cost him more than I think I understood until 4 weeks ago. But the blood in me isn't his. It's his sister's. And it's the blood of a Targaryen prince who died believing he was fighting for something worth the cost. And I am not entirely certain yet what that makes me, Maester Aldrich. except that it explains a very great deal that never made sense before, and it means the world is about to become a good deal more complicated than either of us is prepared for. Aldrich sat back slowly in his chair, the lamp flame guttering between them, and for a long moment neither of them spoke at all, the ravens shifting restlessly overhead in the dark, as though even they had felt the shape of something enormous settle into the room. 7 hells, the Maester said at last, very quietly, and it was, Jon thought, probably the least scholarly thing the man had said since he'd arrived, and somehow, absurdly, it was the moment Jon decided he might actually come to trust him. Chapter 3. The fires that do not lie. The survivors came in 2s and 3s over 4 days, staggering up the King's Road half frozen, half starved, some of them missing fingers to the cold and some missing more than that. They told the story in pieces, the way broken men always tell a story, unable to hold the whole of it in their mouths at once. Stannis Baratheon's army, gutted by desertion and betrayed by his own bannermen, had marched on Winterfell through a blizzard that had eaten half his strength before the Boltons ever lifted a sword against him. What was left had broken in an afternoon. Stannis himself had vanished into the fighting and never come out the other side of it, and no man who reached Castle Black could say for certain whether he died on the field or died somewhere in the snow afterward, alone, hunted down by riders who wanted to be sure. Jon read the first account standing in the yard in the cold, with his breath fogging over the page, and felt something old and tired settle behind his ribs that had nothing to do with grief for Stannis Baratheon, a hard, humorless man Jon had never much liked, and had trusted only so far as their interests overlapped, and everything to do with the arithmetic of it. Another army gone. Another winter's worth of swords that would never be raised against the only enemy that actually mattered, spent instead on a war for a chair 3,000 men had already died fighting over, going back 300 years, with no end to the dying in sight. This is what he warned against, Aemon's memory offered, quiet and grim. Every year I sat at that wall, every letter I wrote and never sent, this was the shape of my fear. Not that the realm would fight and lose, that it would keep fighting the wrong war over and over until there was nothing left to fight the right one with. You'll want to see this, Aldrich said, arriving at his elbow with a second dispatch, this one in a different hand, hastily written. It's from one of the household men who served at Winterfell before the siege. He escaped in the confusion. Lord Commander, the Maester's voice dropped, careful, unwilling to be the one saying it aloud where others might hear. He says Lady Melisandre burned Stannis' daughter, before the battle, a blood sacrifice to open some road through the snow. He swears it happened. He says half the camp saw the pyre. Jon went very still. He had known Shireen Baratheon only from Aemon's fading, second-hand knowledge of the Baratheon line, and from the handful of things Davos had said of her over the winter, a clever, gentle, lonely girl, marked from birth by grayscale and by a father who'd never known quite what to do with a daughter who loved him more plainly than he'd ever managed to love anyone in return. Jon had never met her. He found, standing in the yard with the second dispatch shaking very slightly in his hand, that it didn't matter. Some cruelties didn't require acquaintance to land like a blow. "Where's Davos?" he said. "In the armory, last I saw him, overseeing the dragonglass count, same as every other morning. Keep this from him a while longer. Not out of kindness to me, out of fairness to him. I want to know the truth of it myself before I put that particular knife in his hands." He found Melisandre an hour later, in the small stone chamber off the rookery that she'd claimed for her own since arriving with the remnants of Stannis' broken household weeks before. Not asked for, exactly, simply taken, the way she took most things, with the serene, unbothered confidence of a woman who had never once in her life doubted that whatever she wanted was owed to her by a god who spoke through her fires. She was kneeling before a brazier when he entered, the flames throwing red light up across her face, and she did not look up right away, which told him more than anything that she'd already known he was coming. Lord Snow. Her voice carried that faint, musical accent that made even her simplest sentences sound like liturgy. I wondered how long it would take you to walk through that door. You've had a vision, then. I've had a great many visions. She rose, finally turning to face him, and her red eyes, striking even in ordinary light, unnerving in the fire's glow, moved over him with the particular hunger of a woman examining a puzzle she spent years assembling, and has only now, at last, been handed the final piece of. None of them, until recently, involved you dying and rising again in a single night without my hand anywhere near it. That interests me a great deal, Lord Commander. I have burned a great many nights of my life feeding our lore's flame, begging to understand the shape of the war to come, and I never once saw what happened to you in that yard. Not before it happened. Not after. You're troubled that your God didn't warn you. I'm troubled, she said, with the faint, dangerous patience of a woman choosing her words with great care, that something occurred at the edge of the world powerful enough to bring a dead man back walking and speaking with the wisdom of an old Maester, and the Lord of Light showed me none of it. That has never happened before, Jon Snow. Not once, in all my years of service. I begin to wonder whether there are forces at work in this world that even our Lord does not fully see. There are, Jon said simply. There have always been. Your God is not the only power that ever burned in Valyria, my lady, and you do well to remember that before you decide I'm the answer to every question your visions have failed to give you. Something flickered behind her eyes, surprise, quickly smothered, and beneath the surprise, a wariness Jon hadn't seen in her before, not once, in all the weeks she'd walked Castle Black as though she owned every stone of it. You speak with a confidence I have not heard from you before, she said slowly. Not the confidence of a boy commander trying to sound larger than he is. Something else. Tell me, Lord Snow, what did you see in the dark between your death and your waking? I have looked into fire my whole life searching for even a glimpse past that threshold, and every priest and priestess I have ever known has failed to bring back more than fragments, riddles, half-truths burned at the edges. You walked through that door and came back whole. I would very much like to know what you found there. I found 100 years of another man's memory, Jon said, and watched her face carefully as he said it. A Maester. Blood of the dragon, same as I am, though he spent most of his life making sure no one ever learned that about him. He gave me everything he knew before he died, across half a continent, in the same hour I was dying myself. That's the whole of the miracle, my lady, not your God, not mine, just blood calling to blood at the one moment both ends of it stood at death's door together. He watched the words land, watched her go very still, the fire throwing shifting light across a face that had, for one unguarded instant, lost every scrap of serenity it usually wore like armor. Blood of the dragon, she repeated softly. You are not merely Ned Stark's bastard, then. I suspected it, she said, half to herself. The night I first looked into the flames and saw your face among them, burning, I suspected there was more to you than the North wanted known. I did not imagine. She stopped herself visibly, and when she spoke again her voice had regained some of its old measured calm, though not all of it. The Lord of Light shows visions in fragments, Lord Snow, symbols and impressions a priestess must interpret through years of study and prayer. I have seen you at the center of great fires more times than I can count. I assumed it meant you were meant to burn for our Lord's cause, as so many of the great heroes of the old prophecies were meant to burn. I begin to wonder now whether I had the shape of the vision backward all along. Perhaps you are not meant to burn at all. Perhaps you are the fire itself. Careful, my lady. Something cooled in Jon's voice. You've built your whole faith on the idea that you can read what your visions mean, and act on that reading with total certainty, however much blood it costs to act on it. I've come to tell you that certainty has a price, and I think you're about to find out exactly how steep it is. She went very still again, and this time the stillness had a different quality to it, not surprise but recognition, the look of a woman who has heard in someone else's mouth an accusation she has been quietly, desperately avoiding making to herself. "You know," she said quietly, "I know what you did to Shireen Baratheon." The name landed in the small stone room like a struck bell. Melisandre's face did not crumple. Jon hadn't expected it to, not from a woman who had spent decades training herself to master her own expressions in service of a god who demanded absolute conviction. But something moved behind her eyes, deep and old. And for the first time since Jon had known her, Melisandre of Asshai looked, for just a moment, like a woman rather than a priestess. "You do not understand what stood before us," she said, and her voice had dropped lower, faster, the words coming with the particular urgency of someone defending an act they had already, privately, argued with themselves about 100 times in the dark. "Stannis Baratheon's army was dying in the snow, Lord Snow. Not losing, dying, wholesale, of cold and hunger and desertion. An army that could not reach Winterfell in time to matter, that would have simply frozen to death in the wilderness, and taken every hope of Maester Aemon reborn down with it into the ice. I saw a path through the snow and the flames. I saw king's blood open it. I have burned king's blood before, Lord Snow, Stannis' own nephew, a bastard boy no different in birth than you, and it worked. The storms broke. Robb Stark died the very night I burned that boy, though I never intended that particular blessing, and I have spent every day since wondering how much of what I do is truly our Lord's will and how much is simply." She stopped, and something raw came through, finally, cracking the careful composure, simply a woman desperate enough to believe her God wants what she has already decided she must do. "You knew it might not work," Jon said quietly. "You've just told me you knew, and you burned a 12-year-old girl who loved her father more honestly than any man in that camp anyway. I did what I believed the war required." "You did what let you feel certain," Jon said, "in a moment when certainty was the only thing standing between you, and admitting that your God has been silent, or wrong, or simply indifferent to which side wins, for longer than you've been willing to say aloud. That's not faith, my lady. That's a woman using faith to avoid asking herself a harder question." Melisandre's chin lifted, some of the old fire returning to her eyes, defensive now rather than serene. "And what harder question would that be, Lord Snow, since you seem to know so much tonight?" "Whether our Lord cares at all who wins this war," Jon said, "or whether he's simply fire, old and vast and utterly indifferent, the way the cold beyond the wall is simply cold, and every prophecy you've ever burned a life chasing is nothing more than the shape human minds make out of forces too large to actually understand." He let that sit, watched it land, watched something in her flinch away from the words even as her face fought to stay composed. "I've read the histories your Red Temple doesn't teach its priestesses, Melisandre. I know things about the war between the others and the first men that predate Valyria itself, older than any prophecy of Maester Aemon your order ever wrote down. Fire and ice have fought this exact war a dozen times across the long turning of this world's history, and every time, the men and women who fought it best were not the ones burning children on the certainty of visions. They were the ones who understood exactly what they were fighting and exactly what it would cost, and made their peace with paying that cost honestly, without pretending a god had handed them permission to skip the grief." For a long moment, neither of them spoke. The brazier crackled and spat between them, throwing shadows that climbed the stone walls and folded back down again, and somewhere below in the yard a dog barked twice at nothing. "You did not answer my question," Melisandre said finally, quiet now, almost gentle. "What did you see, Jon Snow, in the dark between your death and your waking? Not the memories, the place itself. What was it?" Jon considered lying to her. Considered, for one brief moment, the strategic value of holding that particular truth close. The way he was learning to hold so many truths close now, weighed and measured before he ever let them loose into the world. He decided instead to answer honestly, because he'd come to understand something about Melisandre in the short time he'd known her. She was dangerous and self-deceiving, and had done something unforgivable in the name of a certainty she'd built to protect herself from doubt. But she was not stupid, and she was not, beneath all of it, cruel for cruelty's own sake. She was a woman who had spent her whole life believing she'd been chosen for something enormous, and who was only now, slowly, starting to suspect she might have been wrong about the shape of it. That kind of doubt, handled correctly, could be turned into something useful. Handled badly, it could curdle into the kind of desperate, dangerous certainty that got children burned on pyres. It was dark, Jon said. Not empty, not peaceful. Dark and cold, and there was something else in it with me. Not evil, not the others, nothing like that. Just an old man, dying at the same moment I was, reaching for the only kinsman he had left in the world because he couldn't bear the thought of dying with everything he knew going to waste. That's the whole truth of it, my lady. No prophecy. No God's hand, yours or any other. Just love and grief, and one very old man refusing to let 100 years of learning die unused. Something in Melisandre's face shifted slowly into an expression Jon hadn't seen there before, not skepticism, not calculation, but something quieter, almost wondering. "That is not nothing, Lord Snow," she said softly. "In my order we have a word for what you're describing. We do not use it lightly, and I have only ever seen it applied in all the old texts to the very rarest kind of magic, magic that does not run on blood or fire or sacrifice at all, but on the plainest, oldest force any of us ever learned to work with. We call it the deepest fire, the one that burns without needing anything to be destroyed to feed it." She studied him for a long moment. "I do not think you understand yet what you are, Jon Snow. I'm not certain I do either, but I no longer think you are a weapon I am meant to sharpen for a war I've already decided the shape of. I think, perhaps, you are something the war has not seen before, and I would be a fool to keep trying to fit you into visions I saw before I understood what I was looking at." "Good," Jon said, "because I'll tell you plainly, my lady, since we're being honest with each other tonight, I need you. Whatever's coming past the wall, fire is the one weapon we know for certain works against it, and you understand fire better than any living soul south of Asshai. I don't intend to lose that, and I don't intend to punish you the way half this castle would want me to if they learned what you'd done to that girl. But I will tell you this once, and I need you to hear it as more than a threat, because it's a promise as much as it is a warning." He stepped closer, close enough that the brazier's light caught both their faces at once. "If you ever again decide, in the privacy of your own certainty, that a child's life is a fair price for a vision you can't verify until it's already too late to take back, I will end you myself, my lady, and I will not lose a single night's sleep over it afterward. You'll serve this war. You'll serve it under my command, not your own reading of Arlor's fires, not any more. And you'll do it knowing that the man giving you that order has looked into darker places than any fire you've ever burned, and found nothing there but grief, and love, and the plain, unglamorous truth that no one, not gods, not priestesses, not princes, gets to decide someone else's death is a price worth paying on their behalf without asking." Melisandre held his gaze for a long, searching moment, and then slowly she bowed her head, not in submission exactly, but in something closer to genuine consideration. A woman weighing a truth she did not want to accept and finding, despite herself, that she could not entirely dismiss it. "I hear you, Lord Snow," she said quietly. "I cannot promise you I will never again act on what I believe the fires show me. That is not a promise I know how to keep. After a lifetime of believing those fires are the only certainty I have ever been given in a world otherwise built on nothing but grief and cruelty. But I will promise you this, I will not act alone again, not on anything that costs a life to buy. I will bring it to you first, and you may tell me I am wrong and I will listen, even if it costs me something to do it." It wasn't everything Jon wanted. It was, he understood, probably the most honest promise the woman had it in her to give, and he decided, standing there in the red firelight with the smell of burning cedar thick in the small stone room, that it would have to be enough for now. Davos found out 3 days later, and Jon had known, the moment he decided to tell him rather than let him hear it second-hand from some half-frozen survivor in the mess hall, that there would be no gentle way to do it. He told him in the small chamber off the Lord Commander's tower, with the door shut, just the two of them and a cup of wine Davos never touched, and he watched the old smuggler's weathered, good-humored face go through disbelief, and then confusion, and then slowly, terribly understanding, as Jon laid out exactly what the survivor's account had said, and exactly what Melisandre herself had confirmed to him directly. "No," Davos said, when Jon finished. His voice had gone flat, stripped of its usual warmth. "No, that's not, Stannis wouldn't have allowed it. Whatever else that man was, whatever cold, hard, unforgiving thing he'd let himself become chasing that throne, he loved his daughter. I watched him with her. I taught that girl to read, Jon. I sat with her in that cabin on Dragonstone and taught her letters because her own father was too consumed with duty to do it himself. And he loved her anyway in the strange, buried way that man loved anything. He allowed it," Jon said quietly. "I don't think he did it easily. I think, from everything I've been able to learn, it very nearly broke him to do it, and I think that breaking is a good part of why his army fell apart so completely once word of it spread through the camp. Men don't fight well for a commander they've watched burn his own child for a vision. But he allowed it, Davos. He stood there and let it happen." Davos didn't speak for a long moment. When he finally did, his voice had gone rough, and his hands, Jon noticed, had curled into fists on the table between them, the old smuggler's scarred knuckles white with the effort of holding something back that wanted very badly to be let loose. "She's here," he said. "Isn't she? In this castle, right now. Davos, she's here and you've let her stay." He looked up and the grief in his eyes had curdled fast into something harder. "Sweet girl, Jon. Sweetest child I ever knew, kinder than half the grown men I've served with, and that woman burned her alive believing a god wanted it, and you've let her keep her rooms in this castle like nothing happened." "I confronted her," Jon said. "I told her in terms she understood completely that if she ever does anything like it again I'll kill her myself. I meant every word of it. That's not the same as justice." "No," Jon agreed. "It isn't. And I understand, better than you know, exactly how much that costs you to hear me say it anyway, that I'm keeping her here, working beside her, because I need what she can do against the enemy that's coming, and I don't have the luxury of spending her the way I'd like to." He let his voice soften, just slightly, enough to let the grief underneath the strategy show through. "I'm not asking you to forgive her, Davos. I'm not sure I've forgiven her myself. I'm asking you to trust that I understand exactly what she is, and exactly what she's capable of doing again if she's ever allowed to feel certain enough. And I am watching her more closely than you can imagine, because I made her a promise too, and I intend to keep it the moment she gives me the smallest reason to think she's forgotten what it cost." Davos sat with that for a long time, jaw working, the old grief and the new grief tangling together into something that had nowhere useful to go. "What do you want from me then?" he said finally. Because I'll not sit at a table with her, Jon. I'll not break bread in the same hall while that woman walks free after what she did. I don't want you at that table, Jon said. I want you somewhere far more useful if you'll take the offer, and I think you might be the only man at Castle Black qualified to do it. He leaned forward. I need someone I trust completely, not merely a good soldier, but a man who understands how the realm actually works, who sat at the small council table and knows exactly how lords and kings maneuver against each other when they think no one honest is watching. I mean to send word south, Davos. Not just to the Citadel, not just quiet letters to old friends like Sam. I mean to tell the realm the truth about what's coming, and I mean to do it in a way that forces men to listen instead of dismissing it as one more bastard's fevered dream from the edge of the world. I need a hand for that work. Someone who can travel where I can't, speak to lords I've never met, and carry my word with weight it wouldn't carry from a raven alone. You want me to be your ambassador. I want you to be more than that if you'll have it. Jon held his gaze. I want you to be the man who reminds me, when I've read 1,000 years of history, and start believing I know better than the living people standing in front of me, that knowledge isn't the same thing as wisdom, and that the man who actually understands how the realm works isn't the one who's read every charter. It's the one who's smuggled onions past 3 different lords' blockades and lived to tell the story. Something in Davos's face cracked, despite the grief still sitting raw and heavy across it, not quite a laugh, but close enough to be its cousin. Onion Knight, he muttered. 7 hells, boy, you really did come back with an old man's memories in your head, didn't you? Nobody's called me that in years and made it sound like a compliment. I mean it as one. Davos studied him for a long moment, weighing something Jon understood he needed to weigh alone, the grief and the offer and the strange, impossible new shape of the world he'd woken into 3 weeks past a war that had already claimed the girl he'd loved like his own. I'll do it, he said finally. Not for her. A glance toward the door, toward the tower where Melisandre kept her rooms, and the words came out low and hard. For Shireen, because if there's any justice left worth chasing in this rotten world, it's making sure whatever comes past that wall gets fought properly, with real strategy and real courage, and not one more child ever gets handed to a fire because some priestess couldn't tell the difference between faith and desperation. He stood, and there was something steadier in him now, some purpose settling into the grief like a keel settling a listing ship. Where do you want me to start? White Harbor first, Jon said. Lord Wyman Manderley's no fool, and he's never loved the Boltons, whatever face he's shown them to keep his people safe. Then south to every lord who will grant you an audience, and some who won't want to but will find they can't quite turn away a knight who served 2 kings honestly. Tell them what's coming. Tell them I've seen it myself at Hardhome with my own eyes. And tell them, Jon paused, and something old and certain moved behind his own eyes, the weight of 100 years of watched history settling into the words. Tell them the wall has held for 8,000 years because good men bled to hold it, and it is not going to hold much longer unless the realm remembers, all at once, and quickly, that there was ever a reason it was built in the first place. Aldrich caught him alone in the rookery 2 nights later, a scroll clutched tight in one ink-stained hand, his face lit with the particular fevered energy of a scholar who has just found the thread he's been chasing. Sam Tarly's latest, he said without preamble, setting the scroll on the table between them. He's gone deeper than I thought he'd dare, Lord Commander. He's found a reference, buried, incomplete, deliberately obscured, but a reference nonetheless to the origin of the others, not merely their existence, their making. Jon's blood went cold in a way that had nothing to do with the tower's perpetual chill. Read it. He copied only a fragment, terrified of what would happen if the full scroll were noticed missing. It speaks of the first men in the earliest age of this world, and the children of the forest they warred against, A war neither side was winning, both sides bleeding out slowly across 1,000 years of skirmish and slaughter. And it speaks of a working Lord Commander, a ritual undertaken by the children in desperation to make a weapon terrible enough to end the war outright. A man taken and remade, given power over ice and death and the endless dark between stars, meant to serve as their soldier against an enemy too numerous to fight any other way. And it worked, Jon said quietly, exactly as well as every desperate weapon in history has ever worked. It escaped them, Aldrich confirmed, his voice hushed now, half with awe and half with dread. Turned on the ones who made it and on everyone else besides, because that is what happens, Lord Commander, when you build a weapon out of enough hatred and enough magic and forget, in your desperation, to build any love into it at all. The children of the forest spent the rest of their history trying to undo what they'd made, and failed, and the little that's left of them, wherever they still hide in this world, has been running from their own mistake for 8,000 years. Jon sat with that for a long time, the ravens shifting restlessly overhead, the cold pressing in through every gap in the tower's ancient stone. It was never simply evil, he thought, and felt Aemon's old, weary grief move through the thought like a current. It was a mistake, a desperate, understandable, catastrophic mistake made by people who thought they had no other choice. That's so much worse, somehow, than if it had simply been born hating us. A monster that hates you, you can at least understand. A weapon that was only ever meant to save someone and became this instead. There's more, Aldrich said quietly. Sam believes, and I am inclined to agree with him, Lord Commander, based on everything else I've found in our own library since I arrived, that dragonglass was never simply a weapon that happens to kill them. It was the tool the children used in the making of the first one. It is not merely their weakness. It may be the one thing in this world that remembers, in whatever way stone can remember, what they were before the ritual remade them. A key, perhaps, as much as a blade. Jon looked up, and something in his face had gone very still, very focused. The way it had gone still in the yard the night he'd first walked back into that hall of frightened, guilty men. Then we're going to need a great deal more of it than we currently have, he said. And we're going to need it before the ice ever reaches the wall, because I don't intend to fight this war with the same desperate mistakes that started it 8,000 years ago. We're going to fight it smarter than that, Maester Aldrich. We're going to fight it like men who have actually read the histories instead of men who are doomed to repeat them. Outside, past the high window, the snow had begun to fall again, thick and silent, and somewhere far beyond the wall's great shadow, patient and ancient and utterly without mercy, something that had once been a desperate answer to an unwinnable war continued its long, slow march south. Chapter 4. Winter's Bastard, Fire's Son. Sansa arrived at Castle Black on a morning so cold the mud in the yard had frozen into ridges like a plowed field, and Jon knew who she was before Ed finished shouting down from the wall, because some part of him, some part that was entirely Jon Snow and had nothing to do with 100 years of borrowed memory, had never stopped listening for that particular sound of hooves. He met her at the gate himself. She looked thinner than he remembered, and harder in the face in a way that made something in his chest ache with a familiar, uncomplicated grief that had nothing to do with strategy or bloodlines. Only a boy who'd grown up beside her, half a sister and half a stranger, watching her ride through a gate she'd once refused to even acknowledge him at. She slid off her horse before it had fully stopped and crossed the space between them at something close to a run. And when she reached him, she didn't say anything at all, just wrapped her arms around him, hard, shaking, and Jon held her back the same way. And for one long moment neither of them was Lord Commander or Lady Stark or anything else the world had made of them. They were just Ned Stark's children alive together, in a world that had spent years trying very hard to make sure that never happened again. "I heard you died," she said finally, pulling back, searching his face like she still expected to find some wound that proved it. "I heard it from 3 different mouths on the road, Jon, and I didn't believe any of them. And then I got here and half the men on the wall wouldn't stop staring at me like I was about to ask them to explain a miracle." "It's a long story," Jon said. "I promise to tell you the whole of it. Not tonight, though. Tonight you look like you need a fire and a hot meal a great deal more than you need a history lesson." Brienne of Tarth dismounted behind her, tall and grim and travel-worn, a young squire close on her heels, and behind them both, further back, a column of weary men Jon recognized by their colors as wildling and freerider escort. Not many, but enough to have gotten a lady safely across 100 miles of hostile country, which told Jon something about how carefully this journey had been planned, and by whom. "Winterfell," Sansa said before he could ask. Her voice had gone flat, controlled, the voice of a woman who had learned, the hard way, exactly how to say terrible things without letting them break her while she said them. "Ramsay Bolton holds it. He married me, Jon. Married me and did things to me I'll tell you about someday when I've found the words for them. And I got out with Brienne's help, and I've come to ask you for men." "You'll have them," Jon said, without a heartbeat's hesitation, and watched something in her face shift, surprise. He realized actual surprise, as though some part of her had expected to have to argue for it, to justify the cost, to convince a Lord Commander bound by oath to take no part in the wars of the realm that this particular war was worth breaking that oath for. "You don't even know how many men I need, or what it'll cost you to give them," she said. "I know exactly what it'll cost," Jon said. "I've spent 3 weeks going over every account of every siege the North has fought in the last 200 years, Sansa. I know the roads to Winterfell better than the men who walk them every season. I know Ramsay Bolton's father by reputation, and Ramsay himself by every cruel rumor that's crawled up the King's Road this past year. And I know exactly why Rickon matters to what's happening there, and exactly what Ramsay intends to do with him, if we're not extremely careful about how we come at this." Sansa's face went very still. "Rickon's alive." "He's alive," Jon said, "and he's being held at Winterfell, which means Ramsay has a hostage he thinks makes him untouchable, and he's not entirely wrong to think it, except that he doesn't know what he's dealing with anymore. He thinks he's facing a bastard boy who will charge his walls out of grief and love and get himself killed doing it, the way half the North's history is written by men who did exactly that. He's about to learn he's facing something else." The letter came 3 days later, pink wax sealing a message written in a hand that was, Jon noted immediately, too neat, too careful, the calligraphy of a man who enjoyed writing cruelty as much as enacting it. "Bastard," it began, and Jon read the whole of it standing in the yard with Sansa at his shoulder, her jaw tight, her hands folded so hard against each other that her knuckles had gone white. "Your false king is dead. His army is broken, his corpse food for the crows. I have his magic sword. I have his queen's daughter, and I fucked her in the light of the 7 godswood in front of the walls where your father, the traitor, once paraded his justice for lesser men. Come see us, bastard. Come see how Winterfell has changed. Give me back my bride and Reek, the henchman who ran away with her. I'll trade you Rickon Stark for their return. Bring your wildling scum to my walls and see how the North remembers itself. I'll flay you living, boy, and send your skin to your other brother, the Greyjoy King, wherever he's washed up hiding. Winterfell is mine. The North remembers, and it remembers I own it now." Sansa read it over his shoulder, her breath coming faster and faster, and when she finished she said nothing at all, just stared at the parchment with an expression that was somewhere between fury and something Jon recognized as the specific, patient hatred of a woman who has already survived worse than this letter, and refuses to let it surprise her twice. He thinks he's already won, Jon said, folding the letter carefully rather than crushing it, because a crushed letter told you a man was reacting and a folded one told you a man was thinking. He wants us to march for Winterfell in a rage. He wants to shape the battlefield before it's even a battlefield, get us thinking about revenge instead of strategy. That's clever, actually. Cruel and clever, and I want you to understand something, Sansa. He's not wrong to try it. Grief makes men stupid. It's made better commanders than me charge walls they should have starved out instead. And what's it made you? Sansa's voice was tight. Curious, Jon said, and something in the flatness of the word made her look up at him properly for the first time since the letter had arrived. About exactly how a man who's never actually held a castle against a determined siege thinks he's going to hold Winterfell against someone who's read the account of every single siege that fortress has ever survived, going back to the days when it wasn't even stone yet. He's playing a game he thinks he invented, Sansa. He has no idea he's playing against someone who's read the rulebook 1,000 times over and knows every trick that's ever worked against those walls, and every trick that's ever failed. The army that marched south from Castle Black 3 days later was not the army the North expected, and that, Jon understood, was itself half the battle before a single sword was drawn. Tormund had brought 2,000 free folk, not merely spearmen, but the giant one, lumbering and half bewildered by his own strength, and archers trained in a style the Southron lords had never once had to answer, and scouts who could move through deep snow faster and quieter than any northern soldier alive, because they'd spent their whole lives learning to survive terrain that would kill a green boy from the Vale in a single night. Jon added to that every man Castle Black could spare without leaving the wall undefended. Not many, 300 at most, and word had gone out, through Davos in the south and through ravens Jon had sent to every northern house, whose sigil he'd memorized along with everything else Aemon had ever known about the lords who bore them, calling for aid against House Bolton in the name of House Stark's rightful heir. The response surprised even him, or would have surprised the boy he'd been 3 months before. The Mormonts came, grim and few but fierce. Lady Lyanna herself no older than 10 and 4 and utterly unwilling to be left behind. The Glovers came, reluctantly, having sworn to the Boltons out of fear, rather than loyalty and glad of an excuse, to break that oath the moment a genuine alternative presented itself. Smaller houses trickled in behind them, the Mazzins, the Walls, the mountain clans who answered to no one but respected strength when they saw it plainly on display. And plain strength, Jon had learned in his very first week as Lord Commander, was a language the North had always understood better than any words a man could offer. It still wasn't enough. Jon knew that from the first day's march, knew it with the cold, unsentimental precision of a mind that had spent 100 years reading exactly how many men a siege actually required, and exactly how badly outnumbered his own force would be against whatever garrison Ramsay had gathered behind Winterfell's walls, reinforced, according to every scrap of intelligence Jon's scouts brought back, by House Umber's treacherous defection to the Bolton banner. We can't win a straight fight, he told the assembled lords the night before they broke camp for the final push, standing over a map laid flat across a table of rough-hewn logs, firelight throwing long shadows across faces that had, every one of them, expected a young lord's confident promises and a hopeless plan to match. Not if Ramsay's smart enough to simply hold his walls and let us bleed ourselves against them, which he is smart enough to do, whatever else he is. So we're not going to give him that fight. We're going to give him a different one entirely. And we're going to make sure he chooses to leave those walls before he's ready to. Because a man forced out of his fortress on someone else's timing has already lost half the advantage he thinks he's holding. And how do you propose to force Ramsay Bolton's hand? Lady Lyanna Mormont said, her voice carrying the flat, unimpressed challenge of a girl who had grown up fast and hard, and had no patience left for pretty speeches. When he's got your little brother behind those walls and every reason in the world to simply wait us out while we starve in the snow outside his gates. Because he doesn't actually want to wait us out, Jon said. He wants me to make a mistake, and he's arrogant enough to believe the fastest way to force that mistake is to bait me into charging his walls in a rage, exactly the way his letter was written to provoke. That means he's going to try to draw me forward before we're ready, show me Rickon, dangle him somewhere I can see but not reach, force me to choose between patience and grief. I intend to let him think that trick is working, right up until the moment it isn't. The morning of the battle came gray and still, snow lying thin and crusted over ground that had frozen and thawed and frozen again a dozen times through the long autumn, and Jon stood at the head of his line with Ghost pacing restlessly at his side, watching the walls of Winterfell rise dark against a colorless sky. Ramsay's men had arranged themselves outside the gates in a broad, open field, a deliberate provocation, a challenge laid down the way. A man lays down a challenge when he's certain of his advantage and wants his enemy to see exactly how certain he is. And there, at the center of that provocation, mounted on a pale horse, flanked by 2 guards, stood a small dark-haired boy Jon recognized instantly from every description Sansa had given him through 3 days of hard riding. And beside the boy, close enough that even at this distance Jon could see the cruel, easy smile on his face, sat Ramsay Bolton himself. "He's going to run him," Jon said quietly, to the small knot of commanders gathered close around him, Tormund, Sansa, Brienne, and Lady Mormont, all mounted, all watching the same scene with the same grim understanding. "That's the play. He'll release the boy, let him run for our lines, and somewhere in that run, an archer's going to put an arrow in him, close enough to our own front rank that half our men see it happen and lose every scrap of discipline in their bodies. He wants us to charge in blind fury the moment that boy falls, straight into whatever formation he's built to receive exactly that kind of charge. Then what do we do?" Sansa's voice was tight, controlled, but her eyes hadn't left the small, distant figure on the pale horse. "We don't let the arrow land." Jon was already moving, already signaling to a knot of riders held back at the rear of the formation. Not heavy cavalry, but the fastest, lightest horsemen Tormund's people had, men chosen the night before for exactly this purpose, briefed on exactly this possibility, because Jon had spent the previous evening reading through every account of hostage exchanges gone wrong in 200 years of northern warfare, and had known, with a certainty that chilled him even as it steadied his hand, precisely what kind of cruelty a man like Ramsay would attempt. "Ride now," he told the riders. "The moment he releases the boy, you go, full gallop, straight for him, and you put yourselves between Rickon and any archer with a line on him. I don't care if you have to catch 3 arrows on your own shields to do it. That boy reaches our lines alive, or every man of you answers to me for it personally." The riders went. Jon watched, chest tight, every muscle in his body wound tense despite the cold, calculating certainty that had carried him this far, because knowing the shape of a trap and watching it spring were 2 entirely different kinds of fear, and no amount of borrowed wisdom made watching a child's life hang on split-second timing any easier to bear. Ramsay released Rickon's horse with a slap to its haunch, and the boy, confused, terrified, clearly having been told to run for his life toward the very lines that might save him, kicked his heels and bolted across the frozen field. An arrow arced out from somewhere in the Bolton line, aimed with the terrible patience of a man who had all the time in the world to enjoy the shot. Jon's riders were already there. The lead horseman threw himself half out of his saddle, shield raised, and the arrow struck the wood with a sound Jon heard clean across the field even at that distance. And then the rider had scooped Rickon bodily off his terrified horse, hauling the boy up in front of him, and the whole knot of riders wheeled as one and thundered back toward the Stark line at a speed that left Ramsay's second arrow, and his third, falling uselessly short. Sansa made a sound beside Jon that wasn't quite a sob and wasn't quite a laugh, some raw thing caught between the two, and Jon reached over without looking and gripped her arm hard, for just a moment, because there wasn't time for more than that, because across the field, Ramsay Bolton's easy, cruel smile had curdled into something else entirely, the first genuine flicker of uncertainty Jon had seen from him since this whole grim performance began. Good, Jon thought, cold and clear beneath the relief flooding through him. Now you know I've read your book better than you have. Let's see how you like fighting a man who isn't grieving on your schedule. Ramsay did not charge, not immediately, and that told Jon everything he needed to know about the kind of commander he was truly facing. Not a fool, whatever else he was, but a man whose cruelty had always outpaced his patience. Someone accustomed to breaking things quickly because breaking things quickly was more satisfying than breaking them well. He held his line at the walls a while longer, clearly recalculating, clearly furious at having his opening move answered so cleanly. And Jon used that hesitation exactly as he'd planned to use it, giving the order to advance not in a single reckless charge, but in the slow, deliberate crawl of a force that wanted to be seen coming, wanted every man on those walls to have time to feel the dread of it building. He'll try to draw us into that open ground between the Wolfswood and the walls, Jon told his commanders, riding at the center of the advance with Longclaw drawn, the cold air sharp in his lungs. It's the same ground his father's own Maester wrote about after Robb's war council studied it for a different campaign, open enough that a larger force feels like it can encircle a smaller one easily, but with a false floor to it, low ground that turns to slush the moment enough boots and hooves churn it, ground that's killed more overconfident cavalry charges in the last 2 centuries than any wall in the north. He's going to let his numbers look overwhelming and try to swallow our center whole. I intend to let him try. You intend to let him surround us. Brienne's voice carried real alarm. I intend to let him think he's surrounding us, Jon corrected. There's a difference, Lady Brienne, and it's the difference that's going to win this battle. He turned in his saddle, address carrying to the ranks nearest him, calm and absolute in a way that had, over the weeks since Castle Black, become as familiar to the men who followed him as his own name. We hold the center thin, deliberately thin, and let his flanks come around us the way he wants them to. 1-1 and the wildling spears anchor the flanks themselves, not the center. Giants don't break formation the way men do, and Ramsay's cavalry has never in its life had to answer a giant standing its ground instead of running from one. The moment his flanking force commits fully around our position, that's when Tormund's reserve comes up from behind the tree line where they've been waiting since before dawn, and we don't get surrounded at all. He does. Tormund, riding close enough to hear, let out a short, delighted bark of a laugh. You've been planning to trap the trapper since before we even broke camp, little crow. I've been planning it since I read his letter, Jon said. A man who writes a letter like that isn't thinking about strategy. He's thinking about how good it's going to feel to watch me break. That kind of thinking has a shape to it, and once you know the shape, it's not difficult to use against him. The battle, when it finally came, unfolded almost exactly as Jon had described it, and watching it happen, watching Ramsay's cavalry commit fully to the encirclement, watching the Bolton flank swing wide and confident around a Stark center that gave ground just enough to look desperate without ever actually breaking, Jon felt something settle in his chest that he recognized, distantly. as a feeling Aemon's memory held in abundance, and Jon Snow himself had almost never had the luxury of feeling in his short, brutal life. The particular, cold satisfaction of watching a plan you have built with your own hands function exactly as you designed it to. One took the first true break in the Bolton line, wading into a knot of encircling infantry with a length of chain in one massive fist, scattering men who had never trained to fight something that size and had no idea, in the chaos of the moment, how to answer it. The wildling spears held the flanks with a discipline that surprised every Bolton officer watching, because every southern account Jon had ever absorbed of the free folk described them as savage, disorganized raiders, and none of those accounts had ever accounted for men who had spent their whole lives fighting for survival against something far worse than any southern army, and had learned, through hard necessity, exactly how to hold a line when holding it meant everything. And then, exactly as the Bolton cavalry realized, too late, that the encirclement they'd committed to had become a trap instead of a triumph, Tormund's reserve came up from the tree line at their rear, and the battle that Ramsay Bolton had built his entire strategy around, the battle where superior numbers swallowed a smaller, grief-stricken enemy whole, collapsed instead into a rout. Jon found Ramsay himself near the gates an hour later, the Bolton banners already coming down around him, most of his surviving men having thrown down their weapons the moment the shape of the day became undeniable. Ramsay stood alone, blood on his blade, his easy, cruel smile entirely gone now, replaced by something colder and more calculating. A man doing the fast, desperate math of a survivor who has just realized every advantage he thought he held has evaporated. "You're not what I was told to expect," Ramsay said as Jon dismounted, Ghost padding silent and menacing at his side. "The bastard of Winterfell come crawling back for his father's house. That's the story everyone's telling. Grieving boy plays soldier for his sister's honor." He laughed, short and humorless. "You didn't play the grieving boy at all, did you? You played me instead. You built your whole plan around the idea that I'd be too broken by grief to think clearly," Jon said. "That's not an unreasonable assumption, Ramsay. Most men would be. I've simply had rather more practice than most men at setting grief aside long enough to do what needs doing." He stepped closer, and something in his voice went very quiet, very still. "You should know, before this goes any further, that I understand exactly why you are what you are. I know your father kept you a secret for years, unacknowledged, hunting with a bow for scraps of his attention, while a legitimate son sat warm in the halls you weren't allowed to enter. I know what it does to a boy, growing up told at every turn that he's worth less than the accident of his birth. I understand that better than almost any man alive, Ramsay, because I lived the shape of it myself, at Winterfell, under this very roof, and I want you to understand that I do not excuse a single thing you've done because of it. Understanding where cruelty comes from is not the same as forgiving it." "Spare me the Maester's lecture," Ramsay spat, though something in his eyes had flickered briefly at the words. "Kill me, then, or drag me off to whatever slow, dignified justice you've decided fits the story you're telling about yourself. I don't much care which." "I'm not going to kill you," Jon said. "And it's not mercy, whatever you might tell yourself about it later. It's arithmetic, same as everything else I've done since I came back from a place you couldn't begin to imagine. My sister is the one you wronged most directly in this castle, Ramsay Bolton, and I think, of everyone standing on this field today, she has earned the right to decide what happens to you far more than I had." Sansa arrived on foot minutes later, Brienne close behind her, and she looked at Ramsay for a long, silent moment. Not with fury, exactly, though the fury was there, banked and old and entirely earned, but with something colder underneath it, the particular clarity of a woman who has spent a great deal of time, in the darkest hours of her captivity, imagining exactly this moment and refusing to let it be anything less than deliberate. "You told me once," she said, "that you'd never let anyone else hurt me, that you'd flay any man who tried because I belonged to you." Her voice didn't shake. "You also told me the North remembers. I want you to know something before this is finished, Ramsay. It does remember. It remembers every single thing you did in this castle, and it's going to remember what happens to you next for a very long time." She turned to Jon. "The kennels," she said simply. "He fed men to those hounds himself. Let them decide his fate. I think that's a fitting piece of justice, don't you, Lord Commander? Let the North's memory be written by the same teeth he trained to serve it." Jon studied her for a long moment, his sister, harder now than the girl who'd left Winterfell for King's Landing all those years ago, and not broken by that hardness, but forged by it into something formidable in her own right, and found, somewhere beneath the cold calculation that had carried him through the whole of this campaign, a fierce and uncomplicated pride. "It's yours to decide," he said. "I told you already. This is your justice to hand down, not mine." They buried what dead there were to bury the next day, and raised the Stark banner over Winterfell's gates for the first time in years. And if the celebration that followed felt smaller and quieter than the songs might later make it sound, that was, Jon thought, exactly as it should be, not a triumphant feast, but the tired, grateful quiet of people who had lost too much already to spend what remained of their grief on false cheer. Rickon, once he'd been fed and warmed and reassured a dozen times over that his siblings were actually there, clung to Sansa's side, and would not let go of her sleeve for hours, flinching whenever a door slammed too loud. And Jon watched the small, silent wreckage a year of captivity had made of a boy who should have spent that year simply being a child, and felt the cold satisfaction of the battle curdle briefly into something far angrier. He'll heal, he told himself, watching Sansa murmur something low and steady to her little brother by the hearth in the great hall that night. He's home now. Home matters more than any strategy I could ever build. That's the thing men forget, chasing power. Home is the only reason any of it is ever worth chasing at all. Lady Lyanna Mormont found him alone on the battlements later that night, staring north into a darkness that had, in the space of a single winter, become far more personal to him than it had ever been before he'd worn the black. "You could be king in the North," she said, without preamble, in the same flat, unimpressed tone she'd used at the War Council 2 nights before. "Every lord who marched with us today saw what you did on that field. Half of them have already started muttering about it in their tents. You beat the Boltons with fewer men and less warning than anyone thought possible, and you did it without losing your head to grief, the way every man expected a bastard boy to. That's the kind of story the North remembers for generations, Lord Snow. That's the kind of story that puts a crown on a man's head whether he asks for one or not." "I don't want a crown," Jon said, and it was true, though he understood, with a clarity Aemon's long memory made unavoidable, exactly how little that particular truth would matter to men who had already begun deciding for themselves what he was owed. "I want the North safe. I want every sword this land can raise pointed north, at the only enemy that's ever actually mattered, instead of pointed at each other over chairs and titles that won't matter at all if the dead come walking before winter's through." "That's a fine sentiment," Lady Mormont said. "It won't stop the lords from offering you the crown anyway. Men need something to believe in when the world's ending, Lord Snow. A crown's as good a thing to believe in as any, and better than most." Jon looked out over the dark, snow-heavy woods beyond Winterfell's walls, and felt, underneath the satisfaction of the day's victory, the old cold weight of everything still waiting to be done. Dragonglass to gather, Valyrian steel to hunt down. A truth about his own blood still unspoken to the wider world, and somewhere far to the south, past a sea Jon had never crossed. A girl he'd never met carrying dragons of her own toward a throne that had killed nearly every Targaryen who had ever sat upon it. "Let them offer it then," he said quietly, almost to himself. "I'll decide what to do with it when the offer's actually made. Tonight, Lady Mormont, I intend to sleep in my father's own hall for the first time since I was a boy, and I intend to enjoy every single moment of that before the world finds some new way to complicate it." She studied him a moment longer, something almost like respect softening the flat challenge of her usual expression, and then, without another word, she turned and left him alone on the battlements, snow falling soft and silent around him, Winterfell's lights burning warm and steady below for the first time in far too long. Chapter 5. The Blood of Old Valyria. Sansa found him in the Godswood 3 days after the battle, standing before the same heart tree their father used to pray beneath, the red leaves stark against the gray morning sky, and something in the careful, deliberate way she approached him told Jon she already suspected what he'd come out here alone to think through. "You've been avoiding me," she said, not unkindly. 3 days home, and you've spent more time with the Maester's books than with your own family. I haven't been avoiding you." Jon didn't turn from the tree. "I've been trying to work out how to tell you something, and I haven't found a good way to say it yet, so I've been putting it off like a coward. There are many things, Jon Snow." She came to stand beside him, arms crossed against the cold. "I've never once thought coward was among them." He was quiet for a long moment, watching the wind move through the pale branches overhead, and then he simply told her, the same way he'd told Aldrich, the same plain, unadorned truth, because there was no version of this that dressing it up in careful language would make easier to hear. "Father wasn't my father," he said. "Not by blood. Aunt Lyanna was my mother, Sansa. She and a Targaryen prince, Rhaegar, before the war that killed them both. Father took me in because he loved his sister more than he feared what the truth would cost him, and he spent the rest of his life protecting a lie to keep me safe from a world that spent 300 years hunting down every Targaryen it could find." Sansa didn't answer right away. She stood very still, staring at the heart tree's carved red face, and when she finally spoke, her voice had gone careful in a way that told Jon she was working hard to keep something enormous from breaking loose all at once. "You're not my brother," she said quietly. "Not really. Not by blood." "I am your brother," Jon said, and turned to face her properly because this, at least, he needed her to hear plainly without hedging. "Blood's not the thing that made us family, Sansa. It was never the thing. Father raised me beside you. I grew up in these halls same as you did, loved the same people, buried the same losses. That doesn't stop being true because of who my mother turned out to be." If anything, he managed something that was almost a smile, though it came out tired. It only proves how much Father was willing to risk to make sure it stayed true. Something in her face crumpled finally, and she reached for him hard the way she had at the gate weeks before. And this time when she pulled back there were tears on her face she didn't bother hiding. "He knew," she said. "All those years, watching people call you bastard, watching Mother." She stopped herself, the old grief and the new understanding colliding visibly behind her eyes. "He knew the truth would have protected you more than the lie ever did, and he chose the lie anyway, because the truth would have gotten you killed." "That's exactly what he chose," Jon said. "And I understand it now in a way I never could have before, Sansa, because I know exactly what's been done to every Targaryen the realm's ever found reason to fear. Father didn't lie to shame me. He lied to save my life, and it cost him something enormous to do it, watching people look down on me for a lie he'd built with his own hands to keep me breathing." "What does this mean?" Sansa said slowly, wiping at her face with the back of one gloved hand. "For what happens next? For the North?" "For you, it means I have a claim," Jon said, "that neither of us fully understands the weight of yet. It means somewhere across the narrow sea there's a woman with 3 dragons who might be my aunt, might be something closer to a rival, might be both at once, depending on how the world decides to shake this out. And it means I have to decide, sooner rather than later, how much of this the North gets to hear before someone else tells it to them first, twisted into whatever shape serves their own purposes best. Sansa studied him for a long moment, and something steadied behind her eyes, the particular hard-won composure of a woman who had learned, through everything Ramsay and Cersei and King's Landing had taught her, exactly how dangerous secrets became once other people got to decide how they were told. "Tell them yourself," she said. "Tell them plainly in your own words before whispers do it for you, and turn it into something uglier than the truth ever was. You've spent your whole life being underestimated because of what people assumed about your birth, Jon. Don't let this become one more thing people get to assume about you instead of understanding." He called the lords together 3 nights later, in the great hall beneath the banners of House Stark that had only just been rehung, and every man and woman who had marched with him against the Boltons crowded the benches, along with a scattering of smaller houses who'd sent word the moment news of the victory reached them, hungry to be seen standing on the winning side of a war that had, until recently, seemed hopelessly lost. Jon stood at the head of the hall, not on the raised dais where his father had once sat in judgment, but on the same level as the rest of them, deliberately, because he understood something about what he was about to say that made standing above them feel like exactly the wrong instinct to indulge. "I owe every one of you the truth," he began, and the hall quieted, sensing, correctly, that this was not going to be a speech about grain stores or garrison assignments. "Not the truth I've let you assume about me, but the whole of it, because I think you've all earned the right to decide, with real information, whether the man you followed against the Boltons is the man you want to keep following, or whether that trust needs to be reconsidered now that you know what I actually am." He told it plainly, the way he'd told Sansa, the way he'd told Aldrich, Lyanna Stark, Rhaegar Targaryen, the truth Ned Stark had carried to his own execution rather than let slip, and the strange, impossible night at Castle Black when Aemon Targaryen's 100 years of memory had poured into a dying boy's mind and refused to let him stay dead. The hall listened in a silence that grew heavier with every sentence, and Jon watched faces shift through the telling, disbelief on some, careful calculation on others, and on a handful, the particular dawning dread of men who had spent their whole lives being taught exactly what House Targaryen had cost the North, 300 years running. "You're telling us," said Lord Glover, when Jon finally fell silent, his voice tight with something that wasn't quite anger but sat close beside it, "that the boy who led us against Ramsay Bolton, the boy half this hall has already started muttering about crowning king in the North, is a dragon." "I'm telling you I have their blood," Jon said. "I don't know yet what that makes me beyond that, Lord Glover, and I won't pretend I do. I've spent my whole life a bastard of Winterfell, raised in these halls, loving the same people you love, bleeding for the same North you bleed for. That part of me hasn't changed because of what I've just told you. But I owed you the truth of my blood before you decided anything further about crowns, because a man shouldn't be asked to swear himself to a king without knowing the whole of what he's swearing to. The Targaryens burned the North's own lords alive," said an old man near the back, one of the Umbers who'd come slinking back into the fold after the battle, his voice shaking with a fear too old and too deeply rooted to be easily argued away. "Harrenhal still stands half-melted from dragonfire, boy. My grandfather told me stories of the field of fire that curdled my blood as a child, and you're standing here telling us that same blood runs in your veins, asking us to trust you with it." "I know the history better than you do, my lord," Jon said, and something cold and certain moved through his voice, the weight of 100 years of memory settling behind the words. "I know it better than any man in this hall, because I carry the memory of someone who lived through the worst of it and spent the rest of his life making sure it never happened again. That's precisely why I'm telling you the truth instead of hiding it, the way every mad Targaryen before me hid their intentions until it was too late to stop what they'd already decided to do. I'm not asking you to trust the name Targaryen. I'm asking you to trust what you've already watched me do. Hold this wall together after a mutiny that should have ended it. March north with fewer men and less warning than any sane commander would have risked. And beat Ramsay Bolton without losing this castle or your children to it. Judge me by that, my lords, not by ghosts 300 years dead. The hall was quiet for a long moment, the weight of it settling, and then Lady Lyanna Mormont's clear, unimpressed voice cut through the silence the way it always seemed to. "He's still the same man who beat the Boltons 3 days ago," she said flatly, to the room at large. "I don't much care what blood runs in his veins so long as it's pointed at the right enemies. The dead are coming, my lords, whatever else any of us decides tonight, and I'd rather have a dragon on our side against them than one more southern lord who's never once set foot past the wall telling us what to fear." A murmur ran through the hall, not quite agreement, but not quite rejection either, the sound of men and women weighing something enormous and finding, despite themselves, that Lady Mormont's cold practicality made a certain undeniable sense. "There's more," Jon said, into that uneasy quiet, and something in his tone made every head in the hall turn back toward him. "You should know that I don't intend to sit quietly on this claim and wait to see what the realm decides to do about it. There's a queen across the narrow sea with 3 living dragons and an army at her back, and depending on how the years ahead unfold, she may be the closest thing to family I have left in this world beyond the people standing in this hall. I intend to reach out to her, not as a rival for a throne I've never once wanted, but as kin, because I think I know, in fact, better than most men alive, exactly how lonely it is to be the last of something, and I won't let pride or fear keep me from at least offering her the chance to not be alone in that the way I very nearly was." The Greyjoy longships came up the coast 3 weeks later, and the first Jon heard of it was a raven from White Harbor carrying Davos's careful, worried hand, warning that a fleet flying no colors at all, black-sailed and silent, had put ashore near the stony shore and burned 2 fishing villages to ash before vanishing back out to sea before any real resistance could be organized. "No colors," Aldrich said, reading the dispatch over Jon's shoulder in the small solar that had once belonged to Ned Stark and now, however uncomfortably, belonged to Jon. "That's a deliberate choice, Lord Commander. A raider who wants to be feared flies his sigil proudly. A man who burns villages and hides his banner is either ashamed, which seems unlikely given the nature of the act, or he's playing a longer game than simple plunder." "It's your own," Jon said, with a certainty that made Aldrich look up sharply. "You've had word." "I don't need word." Jon set the dispatch down, and something old and grim moved behind his eyes. "I know the man's reputation from every account that's ever reached the mainland, and I know the shape of exactly the kind of chaos he thrives in. His brother Balon is dead, drowned by all reports, in circumstances no one's ever fully explained, which tells you something on its own. His niece and nephew are fighting each other for what's left of the Iron Islands, and into that chaos steps a man who spent decades as a pirate lord raiding half the known world, a man clever enough and patient enough to let his own family tear itself apart before he steps in to take whatever's left standing." He tapped the map spread across the table, the northern coastline stretching pale and vulnerable beneath his finger. "He's testing us, Aldrich. Sending ships up our coast with no colors flown, watching how quickly we respond, how far our attention stretched after Ramsay. He's not raiding for plunder. He's gathering information, the same way I would if I were in his place, deciding whether the North is worth the risk of open war or better left alone while he consolidates something bigger. What could a man like that possibly want with the North? Aldrich asked. Beyond simple plunder. The Iron Islands have raided this coast for 1,000 years and never once held it for long. It's poor, cold, and difficult to hold against a determined defense. I don't think he wants the North, Jon said slowly, working through it the way Aemon's memory had taught him to work through any puzzle, not guessing but assembling piece by piece until the shape of the thing became undeniable. I think he wants something the North happens to be sitting close to. There are old stores of Valyrian steel scattered across noble houses up here, more than most southern lords realize. And there's a rumor, old, half-forgotten, buried in the same restricted stacks Sam's been digging through at the Citadel, that a piece of something far older than steel might be hidden somewhere on this coast. Something the old Valyrian sorcerers were said to have brought with them centuries before the Doom. Something powerful enough that even mentioning it directly in the old texts was considered dangerous. You're speaking of the horn, Aldrich said quietly, and something in his voice had gone careful, almost reverent, the particular hush of a scholar approaching a truth he'd spent years assuming was mere legend. The one the old sailors' songs speak of. The one said to bind dragons to a master's will, forged by the children of the forest and lost somewhere in the depths of the sea long before the doom of Valyria ever fell. I don't know if it's real, Jon admitted. I don't know if Euron believes it's real, or if he's simply hunting for anything ancient and Valyrian that might give him an edge in whatever war he's already planning against his own family, or against the realm itself, once that family war is settled. But I know this, a man that patient, that willing to burn his own brother's memory, and his own niece's claim just to sit quietly gathering power while everyone else fights each other, is not a man I intend to leave unwatched while I'm focused entirely on the wall. The emissary arrived at Winterfell's gates a fortnight later, unannounced, under a truce banner that made every guard on the wall tense despite its stated purpose, and Jon received him in the great hall with Sansa at his right hand and Tormund looming, deliberately, at his left, because a show of strength cost nothing and Euron's man had clearly been sent expecting exactly the kind of nervous, undefended reception a lesser lord might have offered. He was a thin, weathered man with salt-cracked skin and eyes that moved over the hall with the flat, assessing patience of someone cataloging every exit and every weapon before he'd said a single word. Lord Snow. He offered a bow shallow enough to be its own kind of insult. My captain sends greetings and a proposal. Your captain burns fishing villages and calls it a greeting, Jon said. I'd hate to see what he considers an insult. Something flickered at the corner of the man's mouth, not quite a smile but close enough to its cousin. Captain Grage regrets the villages. Necessary, he says, to gather certain intelligence about the coast's defenses before he approached you properly. He's a practical man, my lord. He doesn't waste ships on plunder he doesn't need when there's a larger prize worth negotiating for instead. And what prize does he imagine I have that's worth negotiating over? Jon said, rather than simply taking if he believes himself strong enough to take it. Information, the emissary said simply. Captain Greyjoy has heard the rumors coming out of the north these past months. Rumors of Targaryen blood risen at the wall. Rumors of dead men rising and dragons stirring across the narrow sea. He believes the age of quiet lords and quiet chairs is ending, Lord Snow, and he intends to be standing in a position of strength when it does. He offers you this, his fleet, and the Iron Islands behind it, in exchange for your support when the moment comes, in his claim over his niece and nephew's competing claims to the Seastone chair. He believes a king in the north, with dragon blood in his veins and an army of wildlings at his back, would make a very useful ally to have when the Iron Islands finally settle who commands them. And if I refuse, then Captain Greyjoy will find other uses for his fleet, the emissary said, with the same flat, unbothered patience. He mentioned before I left that the coast between here and White Harbor is very long and very poorly defended, and that villages burn just as easily whether or not their lord has agreed to be his friend. The hall had gone very still, and Jon felt Tormund's shift beside him, the big man's hand drifting, unhurried but unmistakable, toward the axe at his belt. Jon didn't move. He studied the emissary for a long, considering moment, weighing the shape of the offer against everything Aemon's memory told him about men like Euron Greyjoy, men who built their power not through brute strength alone, but through the careful, patient cultivation of chaos other men were too proud or too slow to see coming until it had already swallowed them. "Tell your captain," Jon said finally, "that I've read enough history to know exactly how these arrangements end. Every lord who's ever taken a pirate's help in exchange for a promised throne has found, eventually, that the pirate's ambitions grow to match whatever new power he's been handed, and that the debt never quite feels repaid, no matter how much is offered against it. I won't be his ally, and I won't be his enemy either, not yet, because I have a war coming that matters more than his ambitions or his niece's claim or any chair carved out of driftwood and salt. But you'll tell him this too, and tell him plainly, because I think a practical man values plain speech more than pretty threats." He stepped closer, and something in his voice dropped, cold and absolute in a way that made even the seasoned emissary's careful composure falter, just slightly. "If one more village on this coast burns because of him," Jon said, "I won't send ravens or emissaries or careful diplomatic threats in return. I'll come myself, with every wildling spear I can spare and a wolf that's killed more men than his entire crew combined, and I'll burn every ship he owns down to the waterline while he watches. And then I'll let the drowned god explain to him personally exactly how poorly that particular gamble paid off. Tell him I know what he's hunting for on this coast, too, whatever old Valyrian relic he thinks might be hiding beneath these waters. Tell him if he finds it before I do, I'll take it from his cooling corpse rather than let a man that patient and that hungry hold something with that kind of power in his hands." The emissary's flat composure cracked, just slightly, something genuine flickering behind his weathered eyes, not quite fear, but a recalculation, the look of a man realizing the message he carried back would need to be delivered with rather more caution than he'd expected to need. "I'll deliver your words exactly, Lord Snow," he said, and this time his bow on the way out went a fraction deeper than the one he'd offered arriving. "You've made an enemy," Sansa said, once the hall had cleared and the emissary's escort had ridden back out through the gates under their truce banner. "A dangerous one, by every account I've ever heard of that man. I've made an enemy of a man who was always going to become one eventually," Jon said. "The only question was whether I let him think he had the advantage going into it, or whether he understood from the first conversation exactly what kind of resistance he was buying if he pushed this coast any further." He looked out the tall window toward the gray sea beyond the walls, invisible from here but felt, somehow, in the particular cold weight of the wind. "Euron Greyjoy doesn't respect fear, Sansa. He respects men who understand exactly what they're risking and choose to risk it anyway. I've bought us time, not safety. He'll test that boundary again before this is finished, and next time it won't be an emissary under a truce banner. Then what do? We look for the same thing he's looking for," Jon said, "before he finds it first." He turned from the window, and something restless and purposeful had settled into him, the look of a man who'd been waiting for an excuse to move and had just, unexpectedly, been handed one. "Aldrich believes there are old caches of dragonglass buried along this coast, further north than anyone's mind in centuries, forgotten since before the Andals ever crossed the narrow sea. If that horn Euron's hunting for is real, it's more likely hidden near those old workings than anywhere else, because the children of the forest built both, and they wouldn't have scattered their work carelessly across a coast this size. He paused, weighing something. I mean to lead the expedition myself, not delegate it. I need to see what's actually there, not merely read a report about it after the fact. You've just reclaimed Winterfell, Jon. You've just told the North the truth about who you are. You can't simply vanish north along the coast chasing legends, while every lord in this hall is still deciding whether to trust you. That's precisely why I have to go, Jon said. If I sit in this hall waiting for lords to finish deciding what they think of me, I'll spend the whole winter waiting, and winter doesn't wait for anyone's comfort, Sansa. I need you here. You're better at this part than I am, better at holding a room of anxious lords steady with nothing but patience and plain sense, and I trust you with it completely. I need to go find whatever's waiting on that coast before Euron does, because if there's a weapon out there that could turn dragons against their own masters, I would very much rather it end up in careful hands than in the hands of a man who burns villages for information and calls it a greeting. The old mine sat half-collapsed into a hillside 3 days' hard ride north along the coast, its entrance choked with brush and centuries of undisturbed rockfall, and it took Jon's small party, Tormund, a dozen wildling scouts, and Aldrich, insisting despite his obvious discomfort on the cold and the ride, that a scholar's eye was needed for whatever they found, the better part of a day simply to clear enough debris to squeeze through into the dark beyond. The tunnels went deeper than any of them expected, cut with tools no living smith would recognize, walls veined black with dragonglass and seams thick enough to make Tormund whistle low under his breath. Enough glass here to arm every man in the north twice over, he said, running a calloused hand along one dark, glittering seam. Why'd anyone ever stop mining it, little crow? Because the war it was mined for ended, Jon said quietly, holding his torch higher. And men forget, the moment a war ends, exactly why the weapons that won it mattered in the first place. He moved deeper, following some instinct he couldn't fully name, some fragment of Aemon's vast accumulated reading pulling at him the way a half-remembered word pulls at the tongue. They found the chamber near what had once been the mine's deepest working, sealed behind a rockfall that looked, on close inspection, less like accident and more like deliberate collapse. Stones stacked and wedged with a care that spoke of hands trying to bury something rather than simply abandon a tunnel gone too deep to safely work. It took hours to clear, and when they finally broke through, the torchlight fell across a small round chamber, empty of any obvious treasure, its walls carved floor to ceiling with symbols none of them recognized. Not Valyrian script, not the runes of the first men. Something older and stranger than either. Spirals and interlocking shapes that seemed, in the flickering torchlight, to shift and resettle at the edge of vision no matter how directly you looked at them. Children of the forest, Aldrich breathed, running trembling fingers just short of the nearest carving, reverent and afraid in equal measure. This is their work, Lord Commander. I've seen fragments of this script in the oldest texts at the Citadel, always incomplete, always disputed. This is a full working, intact, exactly as they left it. At the chamber's center, on a low stone plinth worn smooth by some process none of them could name, sat nothing at all. An empty space, shaped unmistakably for something that had once rested there and had, at some point in the long turning of centuries, been taken. Someone's already been here, Jon said, and something cold settled into his voice as he crouched to examine the dust around the plinth's base, disturbed in patterns too recent to have settled from the original collapse. Recently. Weeks, maybe less. Euron, Tormund said, and it wasn't a question. Or someone working for him. Jon straightened, torchlight throwing his shadow long and sharp across the ancient carved walls. Whatever sat on this plinth, he has it now, or he's close enough to having it that we've lost whatever advantage finding this place first might have given us. He looked around the chamber one final time, at the strange shifting symbols, at the empty space where something impossibly old had waited, undisturbed, since long before Valyria itself had learned to bind dragons to its will. We're not looking for a hidden relic anymore. We're looking for a man who already has one, and we need to find him before he learns how to use it. Outside, the wind off the sea had picked up, cold and salt-heavy, carrying with it the particular restless weight of a storm still building somewhere far out past the horizon. And Jon Snow stood at the mouth of that ancient mine and felt, for the first time since he'd woken in the snow at Castle Black with 100 years of memory pouring through him, something that was not quite fear and not quite doubt, but close enough kin to both that he did not entirely welcome its arrival. Somewhere out on that gray and restless water, a man patient enough to have waited decades for exactly this moment now held a piece of magic older than every kingdom Jon had ever read about, and Jon understood, standing there in the cold with the sea wind cutting through him, that whatever came next would not wait for him to finish deciding how to answer it. Chapter 6. The Long Night's Answer. The wildlings came through the wall in the dead of night, 3 days after Jon returned from the mine, and the sound of it woke half of Castle Black before the horns had even finished their second call, not the low single note that meant rangers returning, but the frantic, broken rhythm that meant something was coming that no one wanted to name. Jon was already dressed and moving before Ed reached his door. "How many?" he said, taking the steps down from the Lord Commander's tower 2 at a time, ghost a white blur ahead of him in the dark. "Couldn't say for certain, Lord. Whole clans by the look of it. Women, children, old folk half frozen already. They're saying," Ed's voice, usually so flat and unbothered, cracked slightly on the words, "they're saying the dead are 3 days behind them, maybe less." The yard was chaos by the time Jon reached it, hundreds of free folk pouring through the gate in the torchlight, faces gray with a terror that went beyond simple cold, children clutched too tight against chests, old men and women stumbling on legs that had clearly carried them further and faster than they had any right to be carried. Tormund stood at the gate itself, shouting names, hauling stragglers through by the collar, and when he spotted Jon crossing the yard toward him, something in his weathered face had gone entirely, uncharacteristically still. "Hard home again," he said without preamble. "Worse. They didn't just raise the dead this time, little crow. They came through the villages north of the Milkwater like a tide, and nothing we put in front of them slowed it down more than an hour." "How far?" 2 days. "Maybe less if the storm behind them keeps pushing." Tormund's jaw worked. "I've seen war, boy. I've seen raiding parties and blood feuds and every ugly thing men do to each other in the cold. I've never seen anything move like this. It doesn't tire. It doesn't stop to eat or sleep or bury its dead, because it doesn't have dead to bury. It just adds them to itself and keeps coming." Jon looked past him, out through the gate into the dark beyond, where more torches were already visible bobbing along the King's Road, more refugees still coming, and felt something settle into place behind his ribs, not fear, though fear was there too, banked deep and controlled, but a kind of terrible clarity, the sensation of a plan he'd spent weeks building suddenly, undeniably, needing to be finished. Get every one of these people fed, warmed, and inside the tunnel through the wall before dawn, Jon said. "Send riders south to every keep between here and Winterfell. Sansa needs to know exactly how much time we have left. And find Aldrich. Tell him I need the ledger of dragonglass stores brought to the Lord Commander's tower immediately, along with every scrap of what Sam sent us from Old Town. We're not going to have time to improvise once this actually reaches our walls. Melisandre found him an hour before dawn, standing over a map spread across his father's old war table, and something in her face, drawn, pale, her usual serene composure stripped away entirely, told him she'd already looked into her fires that night and hadn't liked what she'd seen. "I saw him," she said quietly. "The one who leads them." Blue eyes, endless as winter itself, and behind him an army that stretches further than any fire has ever shown me before. He is close, Lord Snow, closer than any of the scouts believe. You've seen his face before. I have seen fragments of it, always at a distance, always through smoke and snow that made the shape of him hard to hold clearly. She hesitated. Tonight, for the first time, the flames let me look at him directly, as though something had changed, as though he wanted to be seen. "He knows you're here," Jon said slowly, working through it. "He knows what fire's done against his army before at Hardhome, and he's testing whether he can look back through it now, the same way you look through it at him." He set down the length of dragonglass he'd been turning over in his hands, feeling the smooth, cold weight of it settle against his palm. "Tell me plainly, Melisandre, can we beat him? Not with hope, with truth." She was quiet for a long moment, the fire in the brazier beside her throwing restless shadows across a face that had, over the past months, slowly stripped itself of every easy certainty it had once worn like armor. "I do not know," she said finally, and there was something almost like relief in admitting it plainly, after a lifetime of pretending certainty she'd never actually possessed. "I know fire kills them. I know dragonglass and Valyrian steel kill what serves him. I do not know if any of it is enough against him directly, because I have never once seen, in any flame I've ever burned, what actually happens when that army reaches a wall built specifically to stop it. Perhaps it has never happened before. Perhaps that is the one thing even the oldest prophecies never had cause to record. Then we're going to be the ones who write it down," Jon said, "so that whatever comes after us knows exactly how it's done." Sam's final letter arrived by Raven 2 days later. The same morning, the first distant howls of something that was not wind and was not wolf began carrying down from the haunted forest on a bitter northern wind, and Jon read it standing on the wall itself, snow stinging his face, Aldrich at his shoulder. "Jon, I found it." The final piece, buried in a scroll so old it crumbled at the edges when I unrolled it, hidden behind 3 false catalog entries that took me a full turn of the moon to work through. The children of the forest did not merely make the first of them out of desperation. They bound their creation to a single command, woven into the ritual itself, a command they hoped would let them undo their own mistake if it ever turned against them. I do not know if it still holds after 8,000 years. I do not know if it was ever meant to survive this long, or whether whatever made it can still be reached by the words that made it. But if there is any truth left in that old magic at all, the working can only be undone at its source, true fire, wielded by blood old enough to have burned before the ritual was ever cast. Dragon fire, Jon, not any flame. Dragon's own fire, or blood close enough to it that the old magic cannot tell the difference. I am coming north. I know you'll tell me not to, and I don't care. Gilly and the babe are safe with the Tarly household at Horn Hill, whatever my father thinks of that arrangement. I've spent too long reading about this war from a warm desk in Old Town while you fought it with your own hands. I mean to be there when it's finished, one way or the other. Whatever happens, thank you for trusting me with this, for being my friend when no one else at that miserable castle would have me. Sam. Jon folded the letter carefully, the wind trying to tear it from his fingers, and felt something in him tighten and steady all at once. "Dragonfire," Aldrich said slowly. "We have none, Lord Commander. Whatever queen sits across the narrow sea with her 3 dragons might as well be on the far side of the world for all the use that knowledge does us today." "Not dragonfire," Jon said. "Blood close enough to it. That's what Sam wrote." He looked out over the crenellations. north into the gathering dark, where the howling had grown steadily closer through the long gray afternoon. I have that blood, Aldrich, whatever else I am, whatever this 100 years of borrowed memory has made of me. I am the blood of the dragon, same as any Targaryen who ever sat that throne, and I intend to find out exactly what that's worth before this is finished. They came at dusk on the third day, and the sound of them reached the wall long before the sight did, an endless low keening that seemed to rise up out of the earth itself, carried on wind that had turned so bitterly cold it burned exposed skin within minutes. And beneath that keening, a deeper silence, the terrible hush of an army that needed no drums or horns or shouted commands to move as one. Jon stood atop the wall with every commander he had left, watching the tree line at the edge of the haunted forest. And when the first ranks finally broke from the shadow of the trees, even Tormund, who had faced this enemy before at Hardhome and lived to describe it, went pale and silent. They came in their thousands, and behind the thousands, tens of thousands more, whites shambling in ranks too vast and too orderly for anything that should, by rights, have been simple corpses without will of their own. And at the very center of that endless dark mass, mounted on nothing, walking with a stillness that made every other movement in that army look chaotic by comparison, came a figure of pale ice and blue fire eyes, crowned in something that might once have been antlers and might once have been something else entirely. "That's him," Melisandre said quietly at Jon's side. "The one from my fires." "Then let's give him a war worth remembering," Jon said, and turned to the assembled commanders, and the calm in his voice, absolute and unshakable, was the same calm that had once walked into a hall full of men who'd murdered him and made every one of them lay down their swords. "Dragonglass and Valyrian steel to every man who can hold a blade. Melisandre, your fire holds the gate the moment they breach the outer defenses. No earlier. I want them committed fully before you spend it. Tormund, your archers on the flanking towers, dragonglass tips only, and don't waste a single arrow on anything that isn't already close enough to matter. Aldrich, you and every steward we have left, keep the wounded moving back through the tunnel, because this is going to be long, and it's going to be ugly, and I need every man who falls tonight to have somewhere safe to fall back to. And you," Sansa's voice, arrived only that morning with 100 northern spears she'd insisted on bringing herself despite every argument Jon had made against the risk, carried a fear she was fighting hard to keep out of her tone. "I'm going to do what Aemon spent 100 years hoping someone would eventually be able to do," Jon said, and drew Longclaw, its Valyrian steel blade catching the last gray light of the dying sun. "I'm going to end this." The battle for the wall was not, in the end, the desperate scramble of men fighting simply to survive one more hour that every account Jon had ever absorbed of past skirmishes against the dead had described. It was, instead, exactly what he had spent weeks building it to be. A fight fought on his terms, with every advantage he'd gathered laid out precisely where it would matter most. The whites that reached the outer defenses first met dragonglass-tipped volleys that dropped them by the score before they ever closed to melee range. And the ones that survived the arrows met northern spears braced in formations drilled relentlessly for exactly this purpose over the preceding weeks. Formations Jon had built from 300-year-old accounts of the last true war fought against this enemy, refined with everything Sam had managed to smuggle out of the Citadel's buried archives. One anchored the eastern gate alone, a length of chain in each fist now, and the whites that came at him in waves broke apart against him, the way waves break against stone, over and over, until the ground around him was a churned black wreckage of shattered bone. Melisandre held her fire exactly as long as Jon had asked, and when she finally let it loose, a great roaring wall of flame surging up along the gate the moment the whites had committed fully to their assault. The screaming that followed was unlike anything Jon had ever heard. An army of the dead burning all at once. And for the first time since the fighting began, the endless advancing tide actually, genuinely faltered. But behind all of it, patient, unhurried, the pale figure at the army's heart raised one hand, and the fire Melisandre had spent so carefully guttered and died all at once, snuffed out like a candle in a hard wind, and the screaming stopped, and the whites that had been burning simply kept walking, blackened and smoking but somehow impossibly still moving. "That shouldn't be possible," Melisandre said, her voice for the first time in all the months Jon had known her, genuinely afraid. "Fire is the one thing that has never failed me. Never." "He's not afraid of ordinary fire anymore," Jon said, watching the pale figure across the battlefield, feeling something in his chest go very cold and very clear. "He's had 8,000 years to learn how to answer it. We knew this might happen. This is why I told you to hold nothing back after this moment, Melisandre. Burn everything you have left, every scrap. It buys us time, even if it can't buy us the whole of the war." He turned to Ghost, crouched low and silent beside him, hackles raised, red eyes fixed unblinking on the pale figure across the churned black field, and something passed between them that needed no words at all. "Together, then," Jon said quietly, and vaulted the low wall separating the fighting from the open ground beyond, Ghost surging forward at his side. And behind him he heard Sansa scream his name, heard Tormund shout something furious and desperate that the wind tore away before it could reach him. And none of it slowed him down at all. Because this single moment, walking alone across a field of the dead toward the only enemy that had ever actually mattered, was the moment every fragment of memory Aemon had ever carried through 100 patient, watchful years had been quietly, desperately preparing him for. The Night King did not move to meet him. He simply waited, still as ice itself, as Jon crossed the last of that terrible ground, whites parting around him in eerie, disciplined silence, as though some understanding older than either of them had passed between the ice and the fire. An acknowledgement that this, finally, was the moment the whole long war had been circling toward since before either of their kinds had names for what they were. "You made him," Jon said, when he was close enough that no shout was needed, Longclaw held loose and ready at his side, Ghost pressed against his leg, every muscle in the wolf's body coiled tight. "Not you. Whatever you are now, you weren't the one who chose this. Someone made you, out of grief and desperation, to end a war they couldn't win any other way, and it worked exactly as well as every desperate weapon in history ever works." The pale eyes fixed on him, and Jon felt something move behind them that was not quite thought, not quite memory, but some deep and ancient echo of both, a shape of understanding too vast and too cold for human words to properly hold. "I know what you were before," Jon said, and his voice did not shake, though everything in him, human and ancient both, understood exactly how close he stood to the edge of something that had already ended entire ages of the world. "I know the children who made you believe they were saving themselves. I know they were wrong, and I know you've spent 8,000 years being wrong alongside them, marching south again and again, because that's the only purpose you were ever given, and no one ever gave you another. I'm not here to hate you for that. I understand it better than you'd believe. But I am here to end it, because too many people have died already for a mistake that was never theirs to pay for." The Night King raised one pale hand, slow and deliberate, and where his fingers passed, the very air around them seemed to crystallize, frost spreading outward across the churned earth in intricate, spreading patterns, and Jon felt the cold of it reach for him like a living thing, hungry and patient and utterly without malice. The way winter itself is without malice even as it kills. He didn't retreat from it. He stepped forward instead, into that spreading frost, and drew on everything Aemon had ever carried in 100 years of quiet, patient study. Not merely the memory of history, but something deeper, older, the particular fire that had once let dragons answer to Valyrian blood and Valyrian blood alone. A fire that did not need flame to exist, only will and lineage, and the desperate refusal to let winter win one more time. He felt it kindle somewhere behind his ribs, warm and ancient and entirely his own despite every century that separated him from the men who had first learned to carry it. And when he raised Longclaw to meet the Night King's advancing frost, the Valyrian steel blade caught fire along its edge. Not ordinary flame, but something that burned blue-white and silent. The fire of old Valyria itself answering, at last, to blood that had never fully stopped belonging to it. The Night King's pale eyes widened. Fractionally, the first genuine expression Jon had seen cross that ancient face. And for just a moment, something that might almost have been recognition passed between them. Not fear, not quite, but the dawning understanding of a creature who had marched south 100 times across 100 lost centuries, and had never once, in all that endless patient war, met an enemy who carried this particular fire directly in his blood. They met in the frost and the dark, ice and old fire crashing together, with a sound that seemed to shake the very ground beneath them. And Jon fought with everything Aemon had ever known of the old bindings, everything Sam had unearthed from the Citadel's buried archives, everything 100 desperate years of accumulated wisdom could offer against an enemy that predated every one of those years combined. He was cut twice, frost biting through his jerkin like knives colder than any blade the mutineers had ever driven into him. And still he did not retreat, because retreat, he understood with absolute clarity, was the one thing this endless patient war could never survive. It was Ghost who found the opening, finally, darting low and fast beneath the Night King's guard, while Jon's fire held the ancient king's attention fixed forward, jaws closing hard around one pale ankle, and the moment of distraction, brief as it was, gave Jon exactly the space he needed. He drove Longclaw forward, burning blue-white with old Valyrian fire, straight through the Night King's chest, and the world seemed to hold its breath entirely as the ancient creature looked down at the blade buried in him, and then up, one final time, at the man who had put it there. The shatter, when it came, was not loud. It was almost gentle, ice cracking and spreading outward from the wound in delicate, spreading fractures. And then the Night King simply came apart all at once, into 1,000 glittering fragments that caught the last gray light of the dying day and scattered on the wind like the first snow of a long, long winter finally, at last, beginning to melt. Behind him, across the whole vast churning battlefield, every white that had ever served him crumbled in the same instant, collapsing into dust and bone and stillness. An army 8,000 years in the making, unmade in the space of a single held breath. The silence that followed was the strangest thing Jon had ever experienced, more absolute, somehow, than the endless keening that had preceded it. A quiet so total that for a long moment no one on either side of the shattered battlefield seemed to know quite what to do with it. Then Tormund's voice broke it, a great roaring shout of disbelief and joy that spread through the exhausted northern ranks like wildfire. And Sansa was running across the churned ground, toward him before Jon had even fully lowered Longclaw. And Ghost, bloodied but whole, pressed himself against Jon's legs with a low, exhausted whine that was, in its own way, as eloquent as any human relief. "You did it," Sansa said, reaching him, her hands finding his face, checking for wounds with the same fierce, desperate thoroughness she'd checked Rickon after the battle at Winterfell. "Gods, Jon, you actually did it." "We did it," Jon corrected, looking past her at the exhausted, blood-streaked ranks still holding along the wall, at Melisandre standing pale and hollowed by whatever fire she'd spent, at Tormund already moving among the wounded with the rough, practical care of a man who'd survived 100 battles and knew exactly what came after the fighting stopped. Every one of us did this, Sansa. I only finished it. Aldrich found him an hour later, as the last of the wounded were being carried back through the tunnel, and the first gray light of morning had begun to creep along the eastern horizon, illuminating a battlefield scattered with the quiet, ordinary bones of 8,000 years of accumulated dead, finally allowed to simply be still. Sam's ravens are already flying south, the Maester said quietly. Word of this will reach every corner of the realm within the fortnight. The boy who died and came back. The bastard who beat the Boltons, and now the man who stood alone against the long night itself and ended it with Valyrian fire in his blood. He studied Jon for a long moment. The realm is going to want to know exactly what that means, Lord Commander. What you intend to do with it. Jon looked north, out over the shattered field toward the pale line of dawn creeping up over the haunted forest, and then south, toward Winterfell, toward Sansa and Rickon and everything that had, against every odd Aemon's grim memory had ever calculated, actually managed to survive. I intend to tell them the truth, Jon said. All of it plainly, the same way I told the North. I am the blood of the dragon, and I ended a war 8,000 years in the making, because that blood mattered more than any throne. It might also entitle me to. Whatever the realm decides to do with that truth is theirs to decide. I've spent this whole winter learning that the world doesn't get safer because men hide what they are. It gets safer because they finally decide to stand in the light and let themselves be judged honestly. He turned, and something settled behind his eyes, old and certain, and entirely without fear. There's a queen across the narrow sea who doesn't yet know she has family left in this world. I mean to write to her myself, Aldrich, not as a rival, not as a threat, but as blood, because I think the two of us have spent our whole lives being the last of something, and I don't intend to let either of us stay that lonely any longer than necessary. And if she doesn't want kin, Aldrich said carefully, if she only wants a throne and sees you as one more obstacle standing between her and it, then I'll deal with that the way I've dealt with every other threat since I woke up in that snow, Jon said, and something in his voice carried the full weight of everything Aemon had ever known about the terrible, patient cost of power poorly used, and everything Jon Snow himself had ever known about refusing, absolutely, to be afraid of the answer before the question had even been properly asked. Honestly, directly, and without ever once hiding what I actually am. Behind him, the sun finally cleared the tree line, spilling pale gold light across a battlefield finally, blessedly quiet, and somewhere far to the south, carried on raven's wings toward every corner of a realm that had spent 300 years believing House Targaryen extinguished for good. The truth of what had happened at the wall began, at last, its long journey outward into the waking world.